When I was a kid, there were a group of us kids that pretty much spent every day of our childhood together. For the most part, it was myself, Chuck, and Billy, and the three of us were like brothers. We did everything together, camped in each other's backyards, and spent way too many hours of our days off together. Billy ended up moving away sophomore year, but beyond that, we literally grew up together from elementary school through the years we all graduated. And Billy actually came back home so we could all have a party when he and Chuck finished high school. My point with that is that we were inseparable best friends, and we are still in touch with each other. Now, while the three of us were obviously really close, there was a fourth person in our group for a while, and that was a little girl named Katie. Katie had lived on our block for a few years before we met, and the whole time I knew her, it was just her and her dad that lived at the house. He was a single parent, and none of us had met her mother. Katie was my age, so a year older than the other two, and she was nothing short of a bit strange. Though we did end up figuring out why when all was said and done. And nowadays, I actually feel bad for how we treated her for being weird. I met Katie when I was around 8. She was, to the best of my knowledge, the only girl in the neighborhood that was in our age range. So when we met, it was pretty obvious that she was going to latch onto our trio. We were 8 and 9-year-old boys, so we were a bit annoyed that there was going to be a girl with us, since we were still at that age where girls were a foreign concept. At first, Katie was fine with the three of us though. She was interested in some of the things we were, and she was willing to play our dumb games. We would sword fight with our toy swords, and she was willing to jump in and take a few hits, and she could actually hold her own. She was interested in animals, so she was willing to help me dig up my yard to look for bugs. Basically, she was one of us, for the most part, except when she wasn't herself. Katie was fine probably 95% of the time, but then sometimes she would just be a bit out there, like she was a completely different person. Those times where she would be different, she would sometimes get violent, angry, or just really, really strange. I know that's vague, and I'm not going to get into all of the instances where things were wrong, but I will explain a few of them. The first event of note was one day when we were at Chuck's house and taking turns playing a game on his Super Nintendo. This was typically something we did once a week. We weren't allowed to stay cooped up in the house every day, so it was always super exciting for all of us. I think we were playing one of the Mario games. I'm not sure which one, and it was Katie's turn. Katie wasn't great at the game, but she usually took her losses with grace and laughed about it each time she messed up. Not this time. This time she was playing and she misjudged a jump and ended up dying. Obviously, when this happened, we all chuckled as we did when one of us made a mistake and died. But she didn't. She had a flat stare as she stood up. And by the time the game took us back to the level select screen, Katie had literally jumped up and stomped down on the Nintendo. She smashed it with all of her body weight. And while the console was mostly okay, they actually built those things with this possibility in mind, something I learned later in life, the game ended up bending and snapping in half. Obviously, we all freaked out, and Chuck started bawling. This Super Nintendo was his pride and joy. Katie then looked over at Chuck and put her hands around his throat, literally choking him, and she was telling him to stop crying, that he needed to grow up, that he wasn't a baby, and that if he wanted to cry, she would give him something to cry about. Billy and I jumped into action and pulled her away from Chuck, leaving this whole situation a confusing disaster, and Chuck sitting there looking horrified. Chuck's dad came in to figure out what happened, and we had to explain to him what Katie had done. Strangely enough, Katie actually agreed with our statements, and she was willing to own what happened. She said she was angry, that she wanted to destroy it, so she did. She said that Chuck was crying over nothing and that he needed to grow up. I honestly don't know what really happened after that because Chuck's dad told us to go home, but I do know that Katie's dad brought him a new game, and Katie wasn't really allowed at Chuck's house anymore after that happened. In fact, I don't think Chuck and Katie really spent any time together after this, for good reason. I don't want to really get into all the events that Katie caused because the story could go on for ages, but I do want to go over one of the last things that ended up happening. The thing that I think may have actually caused Katie to be a bit odd. This was around a year after the whole thing with Chuck happened. I was on my own that day and went out into the woods that were behind our neighborhood. I was out there pretending I was some kind of adventurer when who else would I see but Katie? I went over to talk to her, but as I approached, I noticed something weird. Katie was sitting on the ground, her back against the tree, and was eating a sandwich while just talking to no one in particular. I walked up to her to ask who she was talking to, and when she noticed me, she jumped and screamed that I shouldn't be there. I was obviously taken aback and scared, and I asked what I had done wrong. She then started going on about how I was upsetting her mother, how she was having dinner with her and I wasn't invited. I kind of just looked around and mentioned that she was alone, that her mom wasn't there. She flipped out. She started screaming at me aggressively that her mother lived in the woods, that I wasn't allowed to be anywhere near her mother, and that I needed to go home before she hurt me. Again, I was confused, but I just said I was sorry and that I didn't know. Strangely enough, Katie shifted from psychotic and ready to pounce to almost sympathetic. She said it was okay, that if I was really sorry, that she wouldn't be mad at me anymore, and that I was welcome to sit with them. I hesitantly agreed with her, mostly because I will admit that at that time in our relationship, I actually did have a crush on her. So sitting with her was something I was more than willing to do. Yes, I had a crush on Katie in spite of her random strange behavior. I sat at one of the trees and just watched her eat her sandwich and talk. She was talking about school, about all the things that she was going through, and what she was going to be doing that week. She was talking to no one in particular, like she was basically telling her mother about her life. I was a bit curious, so I waited for an opening and actually asked her where her mother was. This is where things turned to haunting. Katie looked at me and started crying, like full on sobbing. I kind of freaked out. I didn't mean to make her cry, so I scooted over to her and gave her a hug and asked her what was wrong. Katie then pulled away and told me that her mother lived in the woods because one night she and her father got into an argument and her dad hurt her. I will say that we were 10, so this was a whole new thing to me. My parents were always happily married, so I didn't understand the situation of my dad hurt my mom. That idea was impossible to me. I asked her how he hurt her, why he hurt her, and so forth, basically interrogating this poor crying girl. And she stopped crying, pulled away from me, and she told me something that made my blood run cold. She looked me in the eyes and said, "My mom's not really living out here. She's dead. My dad killed her. He killed her and buried her out here in the woods. I saw him do it, He doesn't know that I saw it, though. He doesn't know that I know what he did. He doesn't know that I watched him choke her until she died. He doesn't know that I watched him dig the hole and bury her. I watched him do it. She kind of started just rambling all of this and shifting between crying and not crying and looking back. She was clearly traumatized. I honestly think that this is what caused her to be strange and aggressive. She saw this horrifying event and didn't know how to process it. Of course, I told my parents what she said. Being my age, I didn't know what else to do, but I told them what she said to me. Of course, my parents called the cops and they reported what Katie had said, and all of it was this huge mess. The cops ended up doing an investigation, talking with Katie about everything, taking reports from her and her father, asking me about everything. And then they did the excavation. This is where things went from weird to absolutely devastating. They dug up the spot in the woods, and they actually did find the body of a woman. Katie wasn't lying or making any of it up. Her dad had actually killed her mother, and he actually did bury her in the woods, which tells me that she really did watch this all play out. To wrap this up, Katie ended up leaving town to live with someone else in her family. Her father was arrested, and all of this was my fault because she trusted me and I told my parents. Obviously, I know I did the right thing. Her mother deserved justice, and looking back at it as an adult, not telling anyone would have been the worst thing to do. That said, I will never let go of the fact that I changed a huge portion of her life. She was a weird girl, but she was my friend, and I did like her. And because I told my parents what she told me, her whole life changed direction. And I never saw her again. And that day where she told me about what happened was the last time we ever spoke. I never got to say goodbye or anything. I do hope that her life went back to normal after this, as normal as it could be. I hope that she found peace because she deserved it, and I hope that someday she and I can talk again, so I can tell her that I am sorry for all she went through. Katie, if you ever read or hear this story, please know that I've never forgotten you, and I mention your name every single time that I pray. I like to believe that I'm a fairly careful person and that I do a pretty good job keeping myself out of trouble and away from dangerous situations. That said, in as much as I've done a good job at keeping myself safe, I have one thing that happened to me that was genuinely terrifying. And while I wasn't personally hurt, it still messed with my head. It was one of those moments that you never think that you could end up in the middle of, and afterwards, it just kind of sticks with you and creeps up into your mind when you're lying in bed at night. The day this happened was in the middle of summer. I had literally turned 18 a couple days before and had spent a couple days at a friend's house in a nearby town. I was actually driving home in the mid-afternoon. I think it was around 3 or so. I had the windows down and the wind blowing through the car because of how nice it was out, and was just jamming out to some summer pop song, enjoying the drive. As I was driving down a quiet and slightly rural road, I noticed that there was a young woman down the way with her thumb outstretched, which I honestly didn't know that was a thing people did. I thought that whole thumb out on the road was a movie cliche, but there she was. She looked to be in her early 20s, long dark hair and a simple and quite cute sundress. Though I was always warned about the dangers of picking up strangers, something about her seemed harmless. She almost looked like my little sister, just older. So I guess part of me saw some familiarity in her and immediately thought if my sister was out on the road like this, I would want someone to stop for her to see if she was okay. I decided to stop and see if she just needed a quick ride down the road or if she needed to go a long distance. She told me that she was needing a ride to a specific gas station about 10 miles up the road. It was in the direction I was going, and I would have passed by it anyways, so I told her to hop in and said I could get her there. At first, the conversation was incredibly casual and friendly. She told me her name, I told her mine. We chatted about the weather and how absolutely gorgeous it was outside that day. She made a comment about the song that was playing on the radio. I don't remember what song it was, but it was some top 40 one, and she was nodding along to it while singing quietly. She even told me a bit about who she was, how she was a bit of a vagabond, and was doing an experiment to see how far she could go on the kindness of others. This was before van living was a thing, so it was a bit of a foreign concept to me, and I was shocked that it was working out the way it was for her. After a bit of chatting and friendly back and forth, she started talking about how she liked to listen to true crime podcasts and such. It started with her saying that being out and alone like this, she listened to them to be aware of the horrible things that could happen. But then she started talking more and more about various murders, cold cases, and such to the point that I could tell that she was obsessed. I don't mind true crime stuff. It's not my favorite, but I was willing to hear her out because she was clearly passionate about them. However, it shifted from her talking about the podcast to talking about very specific cases in very, very vivid detail. The way that she got excited when she talked about the people dying made me feel a bit uneasy, to say the least. She then turned to me and literally asked, "What do you think it feels like to die?" If she had just made the comment, it would have been one thing, but she said it, turned to me, and just stared at me like she really wanted an answer. I sort of just stammered and mumbled that I didn't know, and that I guess it would just be painful. She laughed and commented that it would probably be the best feeling you could have because, in her words, it would be the final explosion at the end of all the build-up and hype. Then it got worse. She turned back to me and said, "I wish I could find out what it felt like without actually dying." And she seriously smiled at me, like she was expecting me to volunteer to help her. I just sort of said, "Huh, yeah," and tried to keep going without making eye contact, thinking that maybe she would get how creepy she was being. But she followed up with, "If I asked you to help me, would you?" I was pretty obviously taken aback and told her that I wouldn't be able to help her and said sorry, and that I just kind of wanted to focus on driving. She sort of fell back into her seat and said, "All right," before just turning to focus back on the road ahead of us. This made the whole situation feel super awkward and heavy. Like, how do you come back from that kind of comment? Well, her idea of coming back from the comment was to literally throw the door open and jump out of the car while I was going 50 down the road. She literally opened the door, undid her seatbelt, and just jumped out onto the road while I was going full speed. I slammed my brakes and screamed as she jumped, the whole situation playing out in a horrible series of chaotic seconds. I threw the car in park and grabbed my cell phone before running out and checking on her. She was pretty messed up, but was definitely still breathing. I called 911 and told them about what happened. They sent out an ambulance and a few police officers, as this was definitely a suspicious situation. For some reason, the memory of them lifting her onto the stretcher to get her into the ambulance is seared in my brain. Just seeing them try to lift her gently so as to not further her injuries I could tell that she had broken a few things, though, and it was not pretty. I explained to the police about how she wasn't a friend and how I had just picked her up and was giving her a ride. They looked at me like I was crazy. Part of me thinks they were debating whether or not they were thinking I shoved her out of the car. I explained what she said right before she jumped. After a while, I think they got the idea, and maybe they realized with how distraught I was that it wasn't my doing. They did call me back a day or two later to come in and give an official statement, and I was actually informed that they were treating it as an attempted suicide and that they were needing my statement to help get her into a mental health hold. I gave them what they asked for, and that was the end of it. I have no idea what happened to this girl, and I'm terrified to think that she may not be with us anymore. She was such a sweet young lady when we started talking, but she switched over to the crazed person in literally a second. I hope they were able to get her the help she needed, and she was able to continue on her trip to wherever she was going. But this event made me realize that I should be more cautious about not judging a book by its cover. This actually happened to me a few months ago when I went to a small cookout. It was going to be me, my girlfriend Angie, my sister and her husband at my parents' house, and possibly a few of their friends or neighbors. My parents don't live in the best neighborhood, but they make do with what they have. They do have one of the nicer houses on the block, though, surrounded by some pretty trusting neighbors that are a bit younger than them, so I at least felt comfortable knowing they were safe where they were. Angie was kind enough to make potato salad to bring because I fail at cooking almost anything, and I brought soda. Once we got there, I was greeted by my mom in the kitchen, finishing up her cake she always made. It's like a vanilla bean cake with strawberry and blueberry puree mixed in. It is one of the best cakes I've ever had. She also made grilled corn on the cob and baked potatoes, while my dad made the brats, hamburgers, and chicken, since my sister didn't eat red meats. Just laying out our spread for dinner as it will be relevant for later. Shortly after us, my sister showed up with little snack foods like crackers, cheese, chips, and dip. We were all sitting around talking when I realized I hadn't brought out the soda. They had been sitting in the kitchen behind some other items. I went to grab them. My dad mentioned putting them in a cooler, and that way we could get them cold, or at least cooler than it was outside in this heat. As I went to get the cooler and pull some ice out of the deep freeze, I noticed they didn't have any. My parents love ice for some reason, and they always had like a huge bag of it, so it was weird to see it empty. When I went to ask them about it, they said their deep freeze had actually quit working, so they had to move what they could to their freezer and tried to save the rest in their little cooler, which included their ice. They had just got it fixed the day before and apparently forgot to go get more. I offered to go get some more since I didn't think about it anyway, and off my girlfriend and I went for ice. We went to the store that was maybe 3 miles or so away. It was one of the nicer ones in the area, with usually a lot of people around. That also meant there were more sitting outside of the front, asking for money, cigarettes, gas, etc. Nothing new to me. However, as we approached the store, there was a woman sitting nearby with a sign that just said, "Stay safe." She was wearing a mask and sunglasses. She had her hair in a messy bun and was dressed like she just came from church. At first glance, you'd think it was someone doing the normal, but she wasn't asking for anything. She was singing. I couldn't tell you the song, but it sounded gospel-like. As people walked by, she waved at them or nodded. A bit different to say the least, but not the strangest thing I've seen. As we approached the entrance, though, I noticed she stopped singing and pulled her sunglasses up and just stared at us. From the moment we got to the sidewalk and walked in, she stared. Like she recognized us, maybe, but couldn't remember who we were. Once it finally registered she was staring at me, I just smiled and tried my best not to make eye contact. But you know that feeling when there's eyes on the back of your head? I knew she was watching me still. I made a hard dash around the corner once in the store and turned to Angie to ask if she had witnessed that too, and she laughed. She obviously saw it too, but just joked that she was probably trying to intimidate me. Maybe because she had never seen me before. I remember half-ass agreeing with her because why else was she doing that, and why me? From there, we grabbed the ice, paid, and headed back out. The entrance and exit doors are one, so this means I had to walk past Crazy again. So out we go, and not really thinking I needed to be on guard though, just that I would be stared at. My arm suddenly is grabbed by none other than this lady. I look over real quick to once again see her lift her glasses and pull down her mask, and all she says is, "Don't eat the peppers." She has the most serious and concerned look on her face, and I stayed like that for a few seconds. Believe me, it felt a hell of a lot longer, but then she let go of my arm, slowly pulled her mask back up, and started singing again. I walked a little faster to my car while I kept looking back at her. Once again, in the car, I asked if Angie saw that. She again agreed it was weird, but chalked it up to just her being crazy. I thought I was overreacting, but for some reason, the way she looked at me just freaked me out, like she saw something in me. It was weird. Back at my parents' house, we filled up the cooler and Angie teased about the lady at the store. To my surprise though, my parents were not surprised by this. She said she's always up there, and if she's not singing, she'd stop random people at the doors and say something weird to them, but said that they had never been stopped before. They also agreed though to not worry about it, and as it was probably more of the norm that they see. From then, we had a great night. A few of the neighbors came over and then left after drinking too much. All of the food was great and the soda was cold. After people started leaving, me and Angie were the last ones to leave, as we typically are. As we were talking, we got on the subject of produce since my girlfriend was attempting a small vegetable garden on our apartment balcony. My mom remembered that she had bought some banana peppers from a local farmer's market and she thought they would be sweeter, but they were too spicy. They both hate spicy food, so they offered to give them to us, saying we could use the seeds to plant. We didn't hesitate. I don't have a problem with spicy foods, but I also don't specifically seek them out either. We gathered our take-home stuff and headed out. Once we were home and putting stuff away, Angie wanted to try the peppers, so she pulled one out and took a bite of it. She said it was actually sweeter than usual and offered it to me, so I took a bite as well. It tasted as expected, again not being huge on spice, so I just agreed with her. It was only about 9 when we left, and we were both off the next day, so we stayed up to watch a movie. Not too far into the movie, I started getting a really bad dry mouth and found myself constantly clearing my throat. I felt bad because I got up several times to get more water and had this coughing fit, but she seemed more concerned about me, as it just started happening out of nowhere. That's when it started getting harder to breathe. You can guess where this is going. I was having an allergic reaction, and the only thing I ate recently were those damn peppers. Angie got me to the hospital quickly, and they gave me a really strong allergy med, basically, and waited to make sure the swelling in my face went down. It didn't dawn on us until after I got back home that that lady specifically told me not to eat the peppers. How would she have known any of that? My parents weren't with me. My mom didn't buy them from there, and they also weren't even part of dinner. I've also never had an issue with peppers before. I know it's stupid, but I've even tested this since by trying a few other peppers like jalapenos and poblanos, and no reaction. I'm afraid to try another banana pepper again to see if it's now a permanent thing or just that one off time. Another thing I am confused about is I don't know if I'm scared of that woman or impressed. So, thinking back, I actually have a story from back when I was a delivery driver for a certain sandwich shop that pretty much doesn't exist anymore. And while there are certainly people out there that won't think of it as creepy, it was certainly messed up and skeevy. It's one of those stupid memories that you wish you could get out of your head, but will not leave. And when you least expect it, bam, instant revisualization of the situation. And it was not a situation that I want to be reminded of frequently. So, as stated, I worked at a certain sandwich shop that was known for making their sandwiches toasty, as they would put it. Unfortunately, they don't really exist anymore, or at least nowhere near how they used to. I was 18 when I worked there and was basically the second in command to the manager, mostly because I'd been there for 2 years, which made me the longest employee at the time aside from him. Unfortunately, being what was basically the assistant manager meant that when corporate told us we were going to do something experimental, I got put on the lead for it. In this instance, we were told that we were going to start doing delivery during what was essentially the dinner hours. Because of this, we would need a delivery driver, and he intended to hire one, but until then, I had to do the deliveries during my shift, and he was going to do them on the days I was off. I was honestly not happy with this, but since it was so new and wasn't even being advertised yet, it was most likely going to just be people that knew about the location and regulars. Because of that, I was a little more okay with it, but still annoyed. Anyways, after a couple of weeks of doing deliveries, it became pretty clear that the manager wasn't in a rush to hire a real delivery driver. So I was going to be stuck doing it, and I pretty much just accepted that it was my job at that point. And again, most of them were fine. That is, until my manager decided that we didn't have enough deliveries and put flyers on every car in his apartment rental complex and every car in the parking lot of our shared strip mall. Basically, he went hardcore on advertising the deliveries as much as he could, and it resulted in us having more than we could handle, and in places that we'd never gone. This was obviously a mess and really pissed me off, but it's also what led to this delivery that stuck with me. This delivery started just like every other one that I'd gone on, except it was to the rental complex where my manager lived, which was basically the absolute farthest we would go for a delivery. The delivery comes in, I roll my eyes angrily and make the sandwich, then tell the other two workers that I would be back within half an hour, and if another delivery called in, to tell them that it would be a while. I get in my car and I drive out to what was probably one of the darkest rental complexes I have literally ever been to. I spend several minutes trying to figure out which townhome this guy lives in, until I manage to spot his number on what is probably the darkest corner of the entire property. To add to this, he didn't have his porch light on, and it didn't look like there were any lights on inside. I hesitantly park my car in front of his building and just sit there staring. The main thought going through my mind being that I was about to be robbed. It was way too dark and desolate looking for this to go normal. After a couple seconds, I just sigh and get out of my car, then walk up to his door and knock. After knocking, I turn to look back out into the parking lot to make sure that there's no one sneaking up on me. I just kind of stood there awkwardly and stared off into the nearly empty parking lot for longer than I was comfortable with before knocking again. This time, there was a response to my knocking. I heard a guy's voice say, "Who is it?" To which I said, "I'm with the sandwich place you ordered food for delivery." He then responds asking, "How old are you?" This question was weird. I just responded that I was there to deliver his food, and that was all. He pushed again and asked if I was over 18. I really wanted out of the situation, so I just said yes, hoping he would move on. Then he responds with, "Oh, come on in then," which is not something I expected, nor wanted to hear. I politely informed him that I just needed him to take the order since he had already paid for it, and I would be good to go. He then again says that I should just come on in so he didn't have to get up. It was at this point that I was legitimately livid. I wasn't going to risk my life and blindly walk into someone else's house just so this guy could be lazy and not get off his ass for his damn sandwich. I responded as firmly as I could without being rude that I could not enter his home and that I needed to get back to the store. Then said that if he didn't want to get up, I could leave the bag on the porch for him to get at his leisure, but I would not be entering his home. Within a second of me saying this, the door opens and it got worse. The guy that answered was standing there and staring at me with a big grin on his face and was completely naked, wearing nothing but a baseball cap and his socks. Obviously, I jumped. I didn't expect to see some dude in the buff come to the door for his sandwich, much less one with such a creepy stare on his face. I turned to look away and pushed his food forward for him to just take it so we could end the ordeal as quickly as possible. This guy then reaches out and seriously caresses my hand with his, then says, "Oh, come on, no need to be shy. You sure you don't want to come in?" I seriously almost puked as soon as he said this. I more or less shoved the bag at him and turned, making a mad dash to my car. When I started my car and my headlights kicked on, all I could see was him in all his horrifying glory, standing in the doorframe and laughing at me. I pulled out and drove back to the store as quickly as I could. As I was driving, it hit me even harder about how pushy he was for me to come inside. The whole thing just made my skin crawl. When I got back to the store, I called my manager and informed him of the situation, expecting him to be livid that this happened. Much more so for the fact that this guy was practically his neighbor. Much to my surprise, I got nothing more than, "Well, if he didn't hurt you, then we can't do anything about it." I then asked that he be blacklisted from the deliveries, seeing as how he pretty much attempted to do something, and if nothing else, this was indecent exposure. To that, he said, "I can't really blacklist him, so just be more careful next time." And as soon as he told me that I needed to be more careful, I told him to find another assistant manager and that I quit. I hung up, put my hat, apron, and store keys on the desk in the back, and left. I only went back to get my last check, and I didn't even say anything extra to the manager. I was genuinely disgusted that this happened, and also angry and hurt that my manager didn't seem to care. It just pains me to think that if I were a little more naive, a year younger, maybe a bit less observant of the surroundings, I may have thought that it was okay to go into this guy's house, and who knows what would have happened to me. I live in a cozy little home with my son and husband. Since our home is on the smaller side, we usually go to other people's homes for holidays or parties. One past year, we wanted to do something just for our family, so we decided we would go camping for the 4th of July weekend. Our county also doesn't allow fireworks, so we thought we'd find a place in the next state over and have a different view, see a fireworks show, and maybe even light off a few of our own. Our son had never been camping before either, so it would be an exciting first time, and he was really looking forward to it. We went and bought a tent, sleeping bags, and other camping essentials to start preparing. We started going over safety tips as well as making sure we had plenty of first aid stuff, bug spray, sunscreen, and aloe. Some things, though, are a little harder to prepare for. The time came to head out to the campgrounds. The 4th was on a Friday, so we decided to go on Thursday. That way we could get there, look around the area to decide what we wanted to do. Then after we enjoy the 4th, we could spend time doing what we wanted for the rest of the weekend. When we got there, we found our lot that was right by 4 other tents. One was a middle-aged couple that was there with their dog. 2 tents were a family of 5, the parents, 2 kids around 9 or 10, and a toddler. And the last one reminded me of ourselves, a couple with a little boy. As we started setting up, all the kids around were ready to play, going over to each person's tent and asking the kids' ages and names, and if they wanted to go play by the water. He was my firstborn, so I was quite protective of him and didn't want him playing by the lake without us, so I agreed to let him play on the small playground equipment that was right next to our area. I could see him from there, so I was okay with it. The 4 kids were playing and talking about whatever kids talk about, and the parents of the single boy, I'll call him Kyle, came over and introduced themselves. They said this was their second attempt at camping. They tried last year and were forced to evacuate after someone caught part of the campgrounds on fire. They said it was most likely caused by a fire pit that wasn't allowed that got out of control. They said it was fairly close to them because they could see the flames and had to pack up in a rush, which scared Kyle. From what they explained, the poor kid was pretty scared for a while to do anything close to fires or camping related. They mentioned how they eased him into it though by camping in their backyard, which made me think we should have tried that first to see how our kid would react. Overall though, they wanted to say thanks and for letting Kyle play with our son Nathan and compliment how well-mannered he was and being willing to pull Kyle in with the other kids. It was a very proud parent moment for myself. That night and the 4th itself were both great. Since everyone was so kind and welcoming, we had a cookout together and put all of our food into it. The kids were having a blast. We gave some of our little fireworks stuff like smoke bombs to the larger family since they didn't have any, which kept them occupied. I will say those older 2 were a little more on the daredevil side. They were trying to throw smoke bombs in the air and catch them, hold them in their mouths, tried throwing rocks from the gravel road at birds, things like that. Thankfully, Kyle and Nathan stepped back from those activities. Saturday, we decided to have a little more time relaxing. After sleeping in a bit and having breakfast, we decided to go for a little walk through the trees. My father-in-law always took my husband fishing and hunting and was always big on the outdoors, so he knew his trees and wildlife and loved teaching Nathan just the same. To our surprise, Kyle was just as interested and asked to join us. I don't think I would have been too comfortable with it, but then his parents asked to join too. They said they would show us where the fire was and then we could go to a more secluded part of the lake where there were less people. We're not familiar with this campsite, so we agreed and thought at least we'd have some more peaceful time away from the other rowdy kids. So we put on our swimsuits under our clothes, grabbed the things we wanted to take, and headed off. The fire occurred on the other side of the grounds. There were several trees that were still standing, but obviously dead from the fire. There was a patch of what appeared to be dead grass where they attempted to regrow it, but it wasn't doing very well. They had posted a sign as a reminder that fires weren't allowed outside of their permitted pits or grills, too. The area was empty of people, too. It appeared to be open, but no one was staying there. It definitely didn't look pretty, so I'm sure that was why. From there, we decided to go swimming since it was empty. We hung out in the water, we all talked, and the boys were having a lot of fun by themselves. I think they wanted that more, to be able to do something a little more innocent on their own. I felt comfortable enough that they wouldn't get into trouble, and with no one else around, I could loosen up a bit more. At one point, the boys started gathering fallen branches, mud, and rocks to make a cave for a rabbit they saw. I wasn't going to be the one to tell them that they live in holes because they were having fun, so I let them go. They started talking about being short on supplies, and my husband had mentioned one of the trees that were burnt, that they would have softer and easier branches to break off, so they went to start collecting them. They did this once and came back pretty quickly, but the second time they left to gather more, I didn't see them come back for a few minutes, so I hollered for them. When they didn't respond or come back, I got a little suspicious and decided to head over to see what was going on. As I walked over the small hill, I noticed them quickly shuffling around dirt like they were trying to find something or bury something. I just asked them what they were up to, thinking they were just playing some game, but they were both acting standoffish and quiet. I asked if there was something wrong, and Kyle responded no and that he wasn't feeling good anymore. I started to approach them to figure out the change in tones when Nathan said they found something bad. Thinking they were playing with something they found like a lighter, I approached them smiling, saying it would be all right, whatever it was, when Kyle started crying. Nathan pointed to a pile and started talking fast about how they were just trying to get dirt. I was trying to calm down two young boys while also looking over to see what they found, when my stomach dropped. There were bones in the dirt. It was a hand, with part of an arm sticking out from the ground. I just stared at it for a minute, not knowing how to react. I finally grabbed both of the boys by the arm and started rushing them away while shouting for my husband. They all started running over towards me. I guess my tone sounded alarming too. I explained to them what I saw, and the guys went to look. My husband agreed to stay nearby just in case, and the rest of us hurried over to a campsite nearby to ask someone to call a park ranger. From there, it became a blur. The rangers came out and looked. They had to call the police and tape everything off. We were all obviously on edge. After being interviewed by the police and the poor boys being questioned, we were finally cleared to go back to our campsite. At this point, we were ready to go. This definitely wasn't going away, so we decided to just leave. We spoke to law enforcement, gave them our contact info, as well as Kyle's family, because they still seemed like a great little family, and left. Later on, Keith and Marissa, Kyle's parents, contacted us and told us that they identified the body as a little girl who had gone missing about a year back. It was then assumed that the fire was likely used to cover up the murder, though the body wasn't found at that time. It was hard to have that conversation with Nathan and explain that there are some evil people out there, and that's why we are so picky about who he's with, where he goes, and that we want to make sure we know where he is. He was too young to have to witness something like that. It was a terrifying thing to witness, and I don't even know if they ever found the person who did it. But I hope that no one I know ever has to witness or go through something like that. I got my first place shortly after graduating high school in 2009. I already had a stable job that I was working at while in school because they were very flexible when it came to us students and the pay was decent. After school was out, I started working there full time as I wasn't planning on going to college, at least not immediately after high school. So I wanted to make more money and save up to get my own apartment. I applied to a few places and finally landed on this cute little house that was actually split into two sides, making it a duplex, I suppose. One side was a two-bedroom and the other was a one-bedroom. My side would be the one-bedroom. My dad came with me when I did the walkthrough to make sure everything was up to snuff for him, and then we met with the landlord, who would also be my neighbor, as he happened to be living on the other side of the house. I thought he was around the same age as my parents. He had a buzz cut style hair, some facial hair like it had just been growing out, and a pretty average build, but he was short. I was barely over 5 foot, and we were about the same height. It was kind of funny how he had to look up at my dad. We waited out front when we saw him walk out the other side. He introduced himself as Kelly and said that he was given the house by his parents, but knew he wasn't going to need a house that size and decided that he could turn a profit on it by splitting it. After looking around and discussing rent and responsibilities, I went ahead and accepted it. The rent was decent as he included the price of the utilities, so all I had to pay for was internet or cable if I chose to do so. I started moving in sometime that same week. My parents helped me as well as one of my best friends, and even Kelly came over at one point. Once I got everything moved in, my friend stayed over to help me move around boxes and I ordered dinner. When the doorbell rang, I went to get it and was surprised when Kelly was holding my pizza. He said he saw the guy approach and thought he would be kind and pay for it as a celebratory meal. He also said that if I ever needed anything, that I could call him or just knock on his door, especially if anything needed repairs. I thanked him and brought the pizza in, not thinking anything else of it. However, I would soon learn that he wasn't just some generous landlord and helpful neighbor. He seemed to be outside at the same time I was. When I was leaving for work, he would walk out and say good morning, or he would actually be sitting out front in a chair, waving as I drove away. He was also outside when I came home, or would knock on the door if he missed me coming home. It was fine for a while, but then it started getting tiring. After I got home, before I would even take my shoes off, I would stand by the door expecting him to be there shortly. I was right. I tried dropping a subtle hint saying I would be sure to reach out if I needed anything, so that way he didn't have to waste his time coming over all the time. He seemed to get the hint as I stopped seeing him as much in the morning or when I came home. I ended up having a few friends over one night once I got unpacked and settled in, like a housewarming party. Now, none of my friends nor I drank. We preferred eating greasy pizza, drinking weird flavored sodas, and playing video games. So a few hours in, we're all having a good time, playing Monopoly, when I heard a knock at my door. It was Kelly again. This time, he looked annoyed, asking what was going on. I told him I had a few friends over for a housewarming party, and he said something about us being too loud. I apologized, saying I would keep it down, but before I could do anything else, Kelly was looking over my shoulder and shouting something about the game, and pretty much let himself in. He sat down, helped himself to one of my root beers, and cracked jokes with a few of my friends. The thing is, he started acting like he was drunk. My friends were cracking up, and I was too, but maybe a bit more embarrassed than anything. After some time, I showed him to the door and he left, saying he loved us all. Shortly after, my friends dispersed as well. The next day, Kelly came over and apologized for how he acted. He said that's why he doesn't normally drink. I wasn't about to tell him it was root beer, so I just accepted the apology and moved on. It progressively got worse when he would be outside, seemingly drunk, and would make comments about me being gorgeous and making someone happy one day. He even asked for a hug one time when my friend was coming over. She teased me later that he probably liked me, which meant I could get away with more. My first thought was gross, as he looked older, and second, I am not going to take advantage of that. Then he would apologize the next day, saying he was embarrassed and didn't mean what he had said. I just tried to ignore it and move on. But I guess I didn't put my foot down firmly enough, as he thought it would be okay to even let himself in at times. I had called him one time because the toilet seemed to be constantly running and asked if he could take a look at it. I was getting ready to leave when he knocked on the door, saying he was there to look at the toilet. I had to be somewhere but told him it was fine to fix it and that I would be back shortly. I was gone for a few hours, and when I came back, I found him still in my place. I asked him if it was something bad since it had taken so long, and he pretty much explained yes. He said that he was going to have to get a part so I couldn't use it, but if I needed to, I could use his bathroom. I thought it was kind of weird, but agreed, and he left for the night. The next day, I was going to my parents to have dinner and do some laundry. I didn't have my own machines yet. While there, I told my parents about what happened, and my dad suggested something that was easy to fix. He followed me back to my place, checked the toilet himself, and was able to fix the problem that night. He just chalked it up to him probably not knowing what to do, and said I could call him anytime since he always did the repairs on their home. I was much more comfortable with that anyways. Kelly seemed to be upset when I told him that it had been fixed the next day though. But, I mean, he didn't have to fix it or pay for anything, so I didn't understand why. However, he seemed to take this as a chance to do check-ins whenever he wanted. Like, when I was taking a shower and I heard what sounded like a door slamming, I wrapped a towel around me and looked down the hallway to the living room, not seeing anything. I thought maybe I was just hearing things too, and made my way to my bedroom to get dressed. I had my pants on and a bra, but remembered I had left my lotion in the living room that I had just bought sitting by my purse, so I went to grab it. That's when I saw someone standing in the kitchen, and, of course, it was Kelly. I screamed at him, telling him to leave, and he didn't even jump or look scared. He continued to stare at me, smiling, saying he was just doing rounds to make sure everything worked properly. As I grabbed a pillow or my jacket hanging up, trying to cover myself, I continued screaming at him to get the hell out until he finally dropped his hands and just walked out angrily. I locked the door, went back to finish getting dressed, and then called him, yelling at him. I told him he can't just come in at any time he wanted to like that, and how creepy it was, and the fact that he didn't even apologize for it. He said he had no reason to apologize as it was his place and he could go in anytime he wanted to, but he didn't mean to startle me. I didn't know if he just tried taking advantage of me since I was younger, but I had enough. I told my parents about it, and my dad suggested we change the lock. The deadbolt was the same, but we installed a new doorknob. He threatened to charge me more rent since I wasn't allowed to do that. I told my friends, and I had one of my guy friends stay with me one weekend, hoping to deter him when, again, he threatened to raise my rent since I had someone living there that wasn't on the lease. Eventually, my parents convinced me to just leave the place, screw the deposit and get out as he seemed unsafe, which I did. It became a storage place for the most part, for my big items, but otherwise, I moved everything important either back in with my parents or my friend's place. He continued to text me for some time, but I eventually had to change my phone number as he wouldn't let up. There wasn't anything in writing though, which I suppose should have been a red flag from the start. But because of this, he didn't really have any option to take me to court. I just wanted out of that place for good. Thankfully, I never had any creepy neighbors or landlords like that afterwards, and I hope to maintain that streak. I used to live in a pretty rundown apartment complex. I was pretty young, in my mid 20s, but it was still a place of my own. It was a studio, so not much room, which was fine because I didn't have any furniture when I first moved in. I eventually got a futon, which became my couch and bed, and a pre-owned lazy boy style chair. I didn't need much though, so I was fine with it. And when I say run down, I meant it. Sometimes my bathroom light stopped working and I got tired of telling the office, so I watched a video on YouTube to figure out how to fix it, and I did it myself. The doorknob was pretty loose, so I never relied on that lock, and thankfully there was a deadbolt. I just hoped the door frame held up. The neighborhood also wasn't the best, with plenty of robberies and car thefts, so what money I did save on the apartment, I put it into a reserved spot in the secured parking garage. All in all, it was just a place for me to sleep, eat, and play my Xbox. However, it wasn't all bad. I had a pretty chill neighbor at the time, Stacy. He was a very laid-back hippie style guy. I remember when he introduced himself, he told me his real name, but then said he didn't like that name because it was too corporate. So he went by the name Stacy because he liked it. I saw no reason to question him, so I knew him as Stacy. He never wore pants. He was typically wearing shorts like cargo shorts, never jean shorts. If he wasn't wearing a tie-dye shirt, it was either some kind of poncho or just a jean jacket with no shirt underneath it. He had dreads that went past his shoulders and a beard probably equally as long. He had a pretty cool plant that he kept outside his door. I think he said it was some kind of tree, and he took extensive care of it. I often saw him watering it, replacing the pot, or even putting things like eggshells in it to help the soil, as he put it. He also liked to sit outside his apartment with a beer and just look out the entrance door. He often left his door open as he said he was trying to keep it cool in there, and he always had incense going. I just assumed he had troubles with his AC, as I always did. He also invited me over to smoke, but I always politely declined, as that was never really my thing, but I don't judge. We were also living in a state where it was legal. But like clockwork, I would come home from work late at night. He'd be out there with his can, we'd have a small conversation, and he'd invite me over. I'd decline. He'd say that was a bummer and wish me a good night. For the area and building, at least I had a pretty cool neighbor, I thought. However, as expected with an old place like it was, I started hearing a weird scratching sound. The first time, it was late at night, and it was after I got off work, so I figured I was just hearing things and let it go. When I heard it again, I thought maybe it was an appliance, like the fridge or AC unit, so I made a mental note to check them the next day, since I was off. However, during the day, it never seemed to happen, and it also didn't happen every night. So the next night, I was laying in my bed and heard the sound. I sprung up and started hunting for it. To my surprise, the sound wasn't coming from the unit, the fridge, or the hot water heater. So I tried to hone into the sound, and I traced it to part of the wall. My futon was against the left wall with the chair at an angle facing the TV. The TV was in the corner on the opposite side with my desk and computer against the wall opposite of my bed. The sound seemed like it was coming from the wall that my desk was against, but closer to where my TV was. This was also the same wall that I shared with Stacy, so the next day, I asked him if he was hearing the sound too. He said he didn't, but would keep his ears open and let me know. Whatever it was, I felt I needed to let the office people know so they could look into it too. Since it was an old building, I was worried if maybe there were mice that managed to get in and were living in the wall. If that's the case, then they needed to look into it quickly and before it got worse. But as expected, they didn't move quickly at all. I continued to hear the sound for probably a week, and it was driving me insane. You could hear the little scritch and scrapes, and I thought it was going to go crazy. I was already having an unrestful night due to other influences, so this was just adding to it, and I decided to figure it out myself. I didn't know what I was going to do, but in case it was a mouse, I grabbed a big pot to use as a trap and some trail mix I had as bait. I felt along the wall again and started moving my TV and the little entertainment center it sat on so I could get behind it. That's when I saw it. There was a small pile of wall, like plaster and dust, and a hole in the wall. One of my cables was being pulled into it as well. My first thought was, hell no. I wasn't going to let some rodent chew through the cable, especially if it was the one to my Xbox. So I slowly knelt down, put the pot into place, and quickly yanked the cable out of the hole. However, no mouse came running out, nor was there a sound like it was scurrying through the hole, but yet the scratching sound continued. It may have been stupid, but I angled my phone to shine the flashlight into the hole and leaned down into it. What I wasn't expecting to see was someone's hand with their fingers wiggling around. I barely had time to process this when I saw an extremely bloodshot eye looking through the hole, making me jump back. I was kind of on alert, thinking it had to be Stacy, right? This was his wall too, but why would he be doing this? I shouted his name and asked him what the hell he was doing, but I don't think I really got an answer. From what I could hear, he started laughing, a laugh I had never heard from him before. Then he started spouting nonsense. I think I heard things like, "It's there. I can see it. I made it. Where'd it go? Where'd it go? I can get it. Get it? Yes. It won't stop. I can make it stop. I found it. Where'd it go?" It was just the same thing over and over, and I had never seen him like this. So I went out and knocked on his door, but as I heard him yelling, he never answered the door. So I tried opening it myself, and it was unlocked. I opened the door, but didn't go in after seeing what I did. Stacy was still on the floor, digging at the wall with a fork and one of those small garden shovels, repeating basically what I had been hearing. I asked him what the hell he was doing, and he stopped, stood up, and unlike his normal look, he was terrifying. His hair was a mess, he was in just his boxers, and his eyes were red, but also looked kind of hazy. I'm not quite sure how to explain it, but if he was laying down, I would have thought he was dead. My anger and confusion turned to fear and concern when he stood up and was just staring at me like he didn't understand how I got there. I told him to sit down and motioned to his couch, and he slowly walked over to the couch and started talking about hearing them too, and how he was going to find it for me because I was his buddy and his only buddy. Then, as if on cue, he looked at me, said goodnight with a smile, and fell over and started seizing. I knew how to handle people seizing since my mother had them, so I immediately ran to him, laid him down safely, and called 911. They came and got him to the hospital, and after explaining everything, one of them said it may have been drug related. I didn't want to get him in trouble, but I also didn't want him to die, so I mentioned the pot, but the cop laughed and said he knew he used, but that's not what this was. They left, and I didn't see Stacy for a few days, so I just shut his door and watered his plant for him. I told the office about the hole, but that I didn't know what happened, and as expected, they said they would schedule to have it fixed, so I just got a small board and put over the hole in the meantime. When Stacy did come back, he came over and apologized to me for what happened. He explained that he ran out of his normal drug of choice and was given something else to try, and obviously had some pretty bad trips. He said he didn't feel like he was himself, like he wasn't controlling his body. I don't remember what he said it was though. It was a terrifying experience for both of us, and he promised he wasn't ever going to use it again, and thanked me for watering his plant. He then brought over some killer tamales he made the next night. I wouldn't want to experience that trip again, but I also wouldn't mind having him as a neighbor again if that were to ever happen. I want to preface this story by saying that if you have any curiosity about the deep and or dark web, just get rid of it right now. If you're an everyday user and you aren't in the know of how onion routing, encryption, VPNs, etc. work, then use stories like this one to satiate your curiosity. Don't start down that rabbit hole, and don't dig any deeper than you need. That said, let's get into some backstory. I am a tech nerd, 100%. I'm the type of person that was ripping apart old PCs in the 80s and putting them back together just to see what worked with what. Mind you, that was back when I was a kid. I learned about all the tech back then, and I took that passion into my adulthood. So I work in IT, if that wasn't obvious, and I know a lot about what goes on out there on the net. Now that's all well and good, but that's all surface web and surface tech level stuff. The question from here becomes, how does being a geek equal dark web horror story? Simple, I've been there. In fact, I've been there probably more than many of the stories that you've heard on the internet. I've seen quite a bit, and maybe I'll give you a few more stories in the future, but this one is one that I think is worth telling, mostly because it was honestly terrifying. Back when I was on the dark web frequently, there was one site that I used to venture towards frequently. Obviously, I'm not naming the site because, as far as I know, it's still out there. This site was kind of like a dark web bazaar. You could buy pretty much anything and everything you could really want, and it wasn't terribly expensive. I used to buy things that were less than legal, and I even used to sell some stuff that was also less than legal. Honestly, this site had everything. Substances, weapons, stolen goods. If you wanted it, you could find it there. The dealers had their ratings that would pretty much tell you how reputable they were, and the higher the rating, the better the overall service or quality of what you've ordered. Think eBay rating, but for drugs and other illegal stuff. One day and one conversation sticks in my mind as probably the most memorable thing that ever happened while I was on the dark web, in this particular sales site. I was browsing the content for the hell of it, seeing what was out there, what I may have wanted to blow money on, and I saw an entry that was a bit strange. Girlfriend for sale. Honestly, I thought it was a joke. Maybe someone was selling their old silicone doll and wanted to have an eye-catching title. I went to the page and scrolled down to the description, and it didn't help any more than the title. It simply said, "Selling my girlfriend, message for details." At this point, I felt like I had to message the person, so I did. Here's how the conversation went. Me: I wanted to ask about your girlfriend for sale. Him: all right, what do you want to know? Me: pretty much everything. Him: all right, she's 27, a bit on the thicker side. She has black hair, green eyes, freckles. There was more information that he included here. He used other words to describe her body type, gave exact measurements, and went into a bit of personal details on her. I'm not going to put them here, as I want to keep this story out of graphic territory. After he told me all this, I obviously knew it wasn't a sex doll. He was legitimately trying to sell a real person. I wasn't sure what to do or say at this point, so I just said, "Go on." Him, "Would you like to see her? It may make it easier to see if you're really interested." Me, "Okay." He then sent me a few pictures of this woman, tied up and gagged in her basement. She looked exactly like he had explained. Her wrists were bound with duct tape, and she had a chain around her neck that looked to be connected to a concrete pillar in the basement. The look on her face was one of legitimate terror. You could tell that she had been crying excessively and her hair was a mess. He then sent me photos of her in what I'll describe as compromising situations and positions. I won't get into the details, but honestly, it made me want to vomit. When I clicked on this entry on the site, I was expecting it to be a joke, but these pictures and what he had told me had me pretty certain that this was real, and that scared the hell out of me. Then he sent me another message. "I have one other interested buyer that's offering $70K cash by next week. If you can get me at least $75K, she's yours." I was so shocked that the only thing I could think to do was ask what her name was, to which he replied, "Sorry, I can't give out her name in case you would do something stupid like try to find her or contact the police." I replied with, "Oh no, I wouldn't dare. I was just curious." His response to that chilled me to the bone. Good, because it wouldn't matter. There's no one that'll miss her, and on paper, she's been dead for a month. I do what I can to make my transactions stress-free. That includes my prospective buyers. I expect them to help me keep things stress-free. So please don't do anything stupid. He compounded this last sentence with a smiley face emoticon, which really added to the threat, to be honest. I honestly had no idea what to say. I didn't know if this was legitimate or if it was a honeypot seller trying to arrest human traffickers. I just told him that I would try to get the money together, and if he didn't hear from me by the time the other seller came through, that was fine. I didn't want to raise any alarms with this guy, regardless of who he really was. I really don't have much more to the story, other than to say that I have no idea what happened to her or the seller. I didn't follow up, and I just kind of let the situation go. I know this makes me an awful person, and I've lost sleep over it, but I'm more hopeful that it was just a honeypot and that he was trying to lure me into being arrested more than actually trying to sell his girlfriend. Since my parents put me in Boy Scouts as a kid, I fell in love with anything outdoors, like camping and hiking. One thing I could never do, though, was hunt and fish. So when I say the outdoors, that includes wildlife, too. My dad tried to take me hunting once, and I cried. So I could teach you to live out in the wilderness on your own, but we would be living on a vegetarian diet. Sorry. So anyways, as a kid, I would walk around our backyard as it ran along some trees and always had my own little adventure out there. And as I got older, I would go to different parks and trails to challenge myself and learn more. I had a fair share of friends, but not many that were as hyped about hiking as I was. People start craving meat and Wi-Fi after a few days without it. So I found myself going solo, but I was never quite alone. I always brought along my dog, Parker. Parker was a lab, and I got him when he was just a puppy from a friend of my mom's. I worked hard with training him because I wanted to be able to take him with me on these trips and be off leash for it too. I know there are some parks that require a leash, and I still brought it, but if we were deep in the back where there were rarely any people, I let him off. He was very well behaved. He loved being able to run as fast as he can through the trees and jump into water, and he wouldn't hurt anyone. There are plenty of kids that have stopped us before to pet him, and he would sit and patiently wait till they were done. He wouldn't even growl when playing with me. He's always a blast to have tagging along on these adventures of mine. After I finished college, I wanted to go on a trip to some of the best hiking trails I had found. This was going to take me through a couple of states, so I planned on taking at least a month or so. We made it through 2 parks and had a great time too. I made some friends that actually gave me their info because they actually wanted to meet up and do the same thing. I got a few suggestions of places to add to my list as well, and overall just had a great time. It was the third one that really messed up the whole mood of the trip. I don't want to give specifics for privacy reasons on a few sides, but I will say it was in a western state. This park had a huge hiking trail that had campgrounds scattered around, as some people would stop and rest and continue on the next day. There was even an area for rock climbing instead of taking the path all the way around to the top. I loved rock climbing, but I rarely did it since I had Parker with me. My friends joked about me getting a harness to put him on my back, but I think with how heavy he is, that wouldn't be possible or safe. So we just enjoyed the scenery and would walk our way around. The sun was starting to set, and I started noticing people setting up little camps, but I didn't want to be around others, so I tried to push forward some more to be a little more alone. It was getting dark at this point, but I got further up and couldn't hear people anymore, so I decided to stop there. I set up my little tent, pulled out something to eat for me and Parker. Don't worry, he wasn't a vegetarian, and we settled in for the night. Now, most of the time, I don't have trouble sleeping outdoors. The sounds of just crickets or the wind was enough to knock me out, but for some reason, that night, I could not shake this feeling. I tossed and turned for a while, not seeming to be able to get comfortable. The bigger problem I had with this, though, was that Parker was awake too. He was looking at one side of the tent, mouth closed, with his head tilted. It was normal for us to have deer or raccoons walking around, so I figured that's what caught his attention. But that also doesn't normally keep me awake. I decided to peek out there to see what it was, though, and maybe scare it off so we could both get some sleep. Parker was quick to run out of the tent, but there was nothing around and not even a sign of anything. Nothing had been moved or touched. Parker had even seemed surprised when there was nothing there but us. So we went back to the tent and tried to sleep again, without much luck. I felt like I was being watched, like the feeling you get when you know someone is behind you, looking over your shoulder. It was quite an uncomfortable feeling. I finally fell asleep at some point, probably because the exhaustion outweighed my paranoid mind, and managed to sleep for a few hours. When we got up the next morning, we looked around our spot again and saw no signs of anything entering. I just chalked it up to me being paranoid again and not sleeping very well, and told myself I needed to drink more water. So we packed up and moved on. As we got a few hours in, we started running into people that we hadn't seen before. I assumed they were probably there the night before and was at that point ahead of me and had stopped again for a break. They actually had a few kids with them, with probably enough strollers and harnesses for them not to be walking, but to me, that just seemed excessive. I feel this was far too out of the way to take kids so young where you don't know how they could even react to some things out here. Not to mention how loud they were. I'm sorry, people that go to places like that and treat it like it's just a normal public park drive me crazy. Again, I liked being out there to escape civilization, and that stuff ruined it for me. So I tried to get ahead of them as quickly as I could and get back to zoning out alone. It seemed like I had finally gotten past the bulk of the people, as I hadn't seen anyone for a while, and probably wouldn't see many more at this point, or at least none with kids as the path became less visible and more just gravel. With the amount that I had left of the trail, I estimated that I could get close to the end, stay one more night, and then leave. That way I didn't risk walking on the trail in the dark. As we climbed up the trail, I started feeling on edge again, the same way I did the night before. So my first thought again was to look around for wildlife, but when I saw nothing, I became more on edge, wondering if there was someone hiding nearby. It wouldn't be the first time someone was robbed in a park like this. However, I don't take much with me of value other than my dog and a knife that my dad gave me, but people are still dangerous. So I started paying closer attention to my surroundings to make sure nothing caught me by surprise. After a few of not running into anyone or anything, I thought again I was just getting paranoid since I was so secluded. But that's when I started hearing someone crying. It sounded like a really small child. My first thought was I was actually going to run into someone with a baby up here, but when the trail flattened out and I didn't see anyone, it just added to the confusion. But at this point, I was now racking my brain where the crying was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from the brush off the side of the trail. That kicked in my ranger mode, and I was worried that someone may be lost or injured. So I broke off from the trail to go into the dense trees. Sure enough, the crying got louder. I marked my trail however I could by marking the trees, leaving the flags I had with me, things like that, so I could get back easily. The crying got louder, but I didn't find anyone. I stood in the middle of these trees looking around, trying to hone in better where they were. Now, Parker has been beside me this whole time, and I can tell he could hear the crying too by the way he stops panting and cocks his head to the side. So while I'm standing there, I look down at him to see him on all fours looking around. He wasn't sitting and waiting like he does when I normally stop. He looked ready to move. He did this when we were playing fetch or when he was impatiently waiting for me to tell him to follow or something. This also made me realize it wasn't just me. So I gave him the signal to lead the way, and immediately he was looking around, sniffing the ground, and was on a mission. He led me to a pile of dead leaves and branches that looked like it had been purposely put there, like someone was cleaning up and left it there. But it's unusual, at least it had been for me, to see something like that in a national park. That kind of stuff is typically left alone, unless it's close to the trail or something. But when Parker started digging around in it, I did the same. I was horrified thinking of what I could find, but instead, all I found was a baby harness. It was one of those strap ones that you could wear on your back, but what was it doing out there? And where was the owner of this harness? At this point, I was holding the harness, looking to see if it had any tag on it, like a suitcase possibly. I don't have kids, I don't know how it works. When I noticed the crying stopped. I looked around to see if anything changed, but still, no sign of another person. I was thinking I needed to get back and call for help, because this could be more serious than it looked. But when I called for Parker to follow, he had his same stance and was looking around. I was curious what else he had, so I told him to lead again. This time, he would stop and look around and whimper, and then keep moving. It started to worry me with how much he started whimpering, but he wouldn't stop to let me check him out to make sure he wasn't hurt or anything. Sadly, he was definitely on the right trail. He led me to a small ravine that dipped down on the other side of a small cliff. He ran past me to a tree that had fallen and was rotting, and when he got to the other side, he sat down by it and barked for me. When I walked over to the side he was on, I found a woman face down in the mud. I immediately checked her pulse, but by how cold she was, I knew she wasn't alive. It was definitely tragic and not something I would ever want to find on a trip like this. But what was more bizarre to me was that she wasn't dressed like she was hiking or camping. She had on like an office suit. It was a nice skirt, one heel, and even a matching blazer. Why was she out there dressed like that? Shaken, I followed my path back to the trail and managed to make my way to one of the emergency systems that they have along the trail and waited on the side for someone to arrive. I led them down to where she was, gave them my statement, and since it was just the two people, I actually helped them move the tree some so they could get her out better. That's when I noticed she was missing an arm. I think they could tell it was too much for me at that point and let me go. I started walking back up to the path and had to tell the cops what all I knew and how I found her. They actually asked me if Parker was a cadaver dog and was surprised when I said he wasn't. I hadn't even thought about it until he mentioned it. Like, his ability to find her was phenomenal. I actually got a ride back with one of the rangers because at that point, I wasn't really in the mood to finish my trip, let alone sleep there. I left them my information and went to a nearby hotel for the night. I called my parents and told them about what happened, and they were asking if I was okay, and also thought what Parker did was amazing. So that really took me out of the mood for the rest of my trip. I told myself as a kid growing up that I wanted to help people and teach others to appreciate nature, but finding someone too late really takes a lot out of you. All I can say is if you're interested in getting into serious backpacking and hiking, make sure you're prepared and that people know where you're going. I really don't think she was out there for fun, but still, it's important to know. And in case anyone was interested, I found a news article about her being found, but they had no information on who she was, but they did mention she was a mother. So then it made me question the harness I found, which I gave to the police as well. And that was the last I ever heard of it. I'm still hiking and camping today with Parker by my side, but I still wonder sometimes where the crying was coming from and where Parker's ability came from. I used to live in a small town in the Midwest that wasn't exactly the nicest place in the world. We weren't so small that everyone knew everyone else, but we were small enough that most of the large corporations passed over the town when opening new locations, and anytime something new was coming to the town, everyone knew. It's hard to explain really, but I think it's best to look at it as we were a small, unincorporated suburb outside of a large city. The town had a name, but it wasn't one that most people would know. And it was small enough that when you introduced yourself, you would just say that you were from the bigger city to the north. It was small enough that we only had one elementary school and the one high school, if that makes more sense. Anyways, I had a plan when I was in high school that I was going to move as far away from that town when I graduated, and then I graduated and realized that I needed to have money to do anything. So I ended up staying for a few more years to save up and get my own place. During this time, I worked for the big name grocery store that had recently moved into the town. I started as a cashier, but after a few months, the owner had wanted to try something new, and his big idea was implementing a delivery program. Basically, the customer would call in or go to the website and order any number of things. Someone would pick it out, and then the driver would deliver it to the person's house. The only real rules were that the order had to be over $20, and it had to be within 10 minutes of the store. I, of course, was promoted to delivery driver because I had been there longer than most of the other cashiers. I was a bit iffy with it at first. I wasn't a huge fan of going to strangers' houses with groceries, but I didn't have to handle any money since the orders had to be paid for before we did the delivery. So, as my boss would put it, I was at a pretty low risk of being robbed. Plus, it wasn't like I was driving around a car that had a logo or said I was a delivery driver. It was just my old Ford, and the likelihood of someone robbing me in an old, rusted out 90s Fiesta was pretty much zero. Plus, after doing it for a couple weeks, I started feeling like it wasn't that big of a deal. I got to know some of the people in my town better. They were mostly friendly, and people actually did tip cash, so it was kind of neat. Then, of course, there's the event that ruined everything. The one that this story is actually about. We got a delivery to a house that had an address that seemed familiar to me, but I wasn't sure why it was familiar. I didn't live on the street at any point in my life or anything, and I looked at the map at the store, but nothing around it seemed familiar to me. I just shrugged it off that I must have done a delivery over there at some point and the house was familiar because of that. I grabbed their order, which was a dozen frozen pizzas, and headed out. It wasn't until I pulled toward the house that I actually realized why I was somewhat familiar with the house. I once had to pick up a friend of mine from this house to get him away from his not so great lifestyle back when I was like 16. This was what it was commonly known as a trap house, and it was one of two in town. It was an older house that was clearly not kept up, but was actually really nice looking as long as you didn't get close. I looked at the delivery slip in hopes that it was a house nearby or something, and not this specific house, but of course, it was 100% this house. I parked my car in front of the house and just thought to myself that they ordered groceries, they knew you were coming, and nothing bad would happen. I got out, walked up to the front, and as soon as I stepped in and closed the gate to the front yard, all hell broke loose. Apparently, one of the inhabitants heard me walking up the sidewalk because she threw open the front door and immediately started screaming at me, asking who the hell I was, what I was doing in their yard, and most importantly, screaming that if I moved, she was going to put a slug in my head. That last statement was the one that bothered me the most, obviously, because she was walking toward me with a double-barrel shotgun and her finger shaking near the trigger. I tried to tell her that I was with the grocery store and that I was delivering food, and this was apparently not okay with her. She actually pushed me to the ground and put the barrel of the gun to my head and started yelling about how I was obviously a cop and that I needed to say my last goodbyes to Jesus because she was going to end me. I remember just begging and saying that I wasn't a cop. I tried to push the groceries towards her and tell her that I was a delivery driver, but the words were not coming out. I seriously thought I was about to die because this woman was clearly not thinking straight, and I had apparently walked up at the wrong time. Then, my savior, a guy named Ken, walked out the door and in the most chilled and non-bothered voice said, "Ayo, Mary, you need to chill. He's not a cop. He's here to bring me my pizzas." When I say unbothered, I mean completely calm and damn near like a surfer. The woman with the gun, I'm assuming her name was Mary, completely changed faces and reached down to help me up and said she was sorry before seriously laughing at the whole thing. She thought it was the funniest thing to happen to her all week. She was cracking up and just saying that she almost killed a kid over nothing. I just nodded and said it was okay and tried to chuckle with her. Then Ken walked over to us and looked through the bags to make sure all his pizzas were there. Again, like nothing had just happened. He counted them out and said they were all there and that he appreciated me bringing them out because his car was in the shop. This was the most awkward conversation I'd ever had with anyone. confirming that all the food was there while thinking that I was going to need to change my pants, while the woman that nearly blew my head off was chuckling and slapping her legs in a laughing fit. Ken then handed me a $5 bill and said it was for my troubles, and that Mary wasn't normally like that. She was just having a bad morning. I took the money and made it away from that house as quickly as I could. I have no real way of explaining the feeling I had afterwards other than pure adrenaline. And the whole way back to the store, I was shaking and my heart was racing. I got back and I told my manager what happened, and he said he would make a note of it on their account, but that he couldn't blacklist them. Thankfully, they never did order for delivery again, and while I did see Ken come into the store a couple times, I never saw Mary again, thankfully. Surprisingly enough, I kept doing the job for another year after that, but only because I needed the money. Once I had enough saved, I got out of there and moved to a nicer town on the other side of my state. And now the only reason I go back is to see my mom for her birthday and Christmas. When my parents were still together, my younger brother and I went to a public school for elementary and middle school until they split up. My mom got custody of us and remarried. However, because of my stepdad's job, we had to move. My stepdad, Charles, was a bit too uppity, in my opinion, which then began to warp my mother into the same type of person. Because of this, they felt our family was too good for public schools, so we had to go to private schools when we moved. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure there were plenty of kids there that enjoyed it. My brother was still in elementary school, and he seemed to like it, but I hated it. Most of the teachers were really strict. If you were late at all, even if it was because you just had locker troubles, you were sent away and your parents knew about it that night. Thankfully, there were some kids that were like me, forced into private school thinking it was a better education and that it would save the troubled kids. We would grin and bear it and then have our fun outside of school. Thankfully, most of our parents felt we had to be good kids too and didn't question us hanging out with each other. That was our chance to ride our bikes and skateboards around, take turns playing on our handhelds as long as we wanted, and just explore places we shouldn't have. Some of my friends were a little more intense than others, like bringing alcohol to school. I'd be lying though if I said I didn't partake in any. I suppose it was my way of acting out. I only got to see my dad on weekends and some holidays, and I didn't want to move, go to a new school, and meet new friends. I had to leave all of that behind, and like it was no big deal. I was never happy about that. So after school games, we would hang out and enjoy some party time, free of adults. Just to explain a little bit as to where we would hang out, our high school was pretty secluded. It had a long entrance and a pretty big parking lot in the front that wrapped around the side and into the back, which is where the buses parked to drop us off and pick us up. Behind the school and parking lot was our track field, and behind that, and on the other side, it was still fenced off by trees, and a lot of them. I knew the woods went back pretty far because during one of the track meets, one of the girls on the team, Dana, had gone back there with me and we made out. It was an awesome place to go to hide from others and just chill. They just had a small gate that went over the entrance, so it was pretty easy for us to sneak over it and come and go. At this time, Dana and I had started seeing each other quite regularly. Her parents seemed nice enough, but of course, being kids still, neither of our parents wanted us to be alone. So the closest alone time we got was at these parties and track meets. It was a Friday night, and we were going to meet our friends at the school to hang out for a while. The five of us got there, set up our little crappy radio, and Dylan shared the refreshments. We were all talking, complaining about school, and laughing at things that happened and enjoying our time. I think it was about an hour in or so when Dana said that she had to use the restroom, so she was going in the trees and told us not to go in there. I waved her on and we kept talking. I was a bit buzzed at this point and didn't realize that Dana hadn't come back yet till one of the other girls mentioned it. We agreed to have one of them go look for her in case there was something wrong. After a few more minutes, she came back saying she still couldn't find her. I was just thinking either she didn't look hard enough or maybe Dana was either hiding or passed out. So I pulled out my little flashlight and started looking for her. After several minutes and calling out for her to no avail, I went back to see if maybe she made her way back in the process. She had not come back. At this point, I was starting to get a bit flustered. First, I was getting mad at them, saying the prank wasn't funny, but when their face was just as concerned was when I started to really get scared. We gathered our stuff and started looking around for her. One of the girls, Tammy, tried to call and text her, but Dana just had a little prepaid phone, so we didn't know how much time she even had on it, but both went unanswered. We called out for her, paired up, and still nothing. We ended up making our way to the other side of the trees, which seemed to just be a gravel road, but no trace of her. At this point, with all of us out of ideas and terrified, we had to call an adult. Tammy called her sister since she was the one that dropped her and her friend off here. We explained to her what happened, and she also suggested we call our parents. None of that was pleasant. We had to explain what we were doing out there. We had to explain every detail as to where we stayed, where she went, full statements, which also meant our parents now knew. So yeah, I got grounded, but I didn't even care about that. The police were out there looking for Dana that night, and they never found her. I know there were rumors floating around about her running away or being kidnapped, but I just knew she wouldn't have ran away. She wasn't really troubled. She seemed just like us, but never hinted she wanted to leave. It was about 2 or 3 weeks later when they finally found her. She ended up stumbling into a gas station wearing like a nightgown, and they called the cops. Unfortunately, the rest of this is just from what I've heard from the news and rumors. I heard at school that the person working at the gas station that night saw her come in and she looked disheveled and malnourished, but she didn't say much to the guy other than wanting to go home. She never returned to school. Never saw her when she returned. I asked my parents if they would take me to see her, and they were hesitant at first, but surprisingly, my mom said she would ask if she could have company. Unfortunately, as I was told when I got older, her parents wanted nothing to do with us, thinking I may have had something to do with it. I guess the cops didn't though, because I was never brought back for another statement or anything. Or maybe that was Dana reaffirming our innocence. Apparently, she didn't talk about it for a while though. I wouldn't learn what had really happened until I saw it on the news. That, and I started putting the pieces together based on the questioning some of us students were getting by police and other teachers at the school. It was them basically looking for a person in the questioning of her abduction. The person in question was one of our substitute teachers. School definitely felt different, and even among the teachers, but I didn't realize that may have had something to do with it. He did end up getting caught, sickeningly, him and his wife both. It was stated that Dana was pretty close to them as she had started dog sitting for them and got to know the couple. That night, he was driving by and apparently Dana had made her way through the trees and he stopped her and put her in his car. He then took her home and they kept her there that whole time. She managed to sneak out at some point and just took off to find help. I felt awful, and at times I still do, thinking I could have prevented all of this, but I've gone through counseling since to try and help. I've also since graduated from a different school, of course, but still have not had any contact with her. I just hope that she's been able to move on and live a happy life since. Back in the late 2000s, me and my then boyfriend Omar were taking an impromptu road trip. We just wanted to get away, so we just set off heading east in whatever direction we were pulled and stopped at places we were drawn to. We didn't have a lot of money, so we slept in our car a lot, which was fine, as it gave us more time to look around at places to go. However, our idea of places to go also included urban exploring. It was fun enough finding places local to explore, but even better when out of state, places you've never been to or heard of and going in blind. We were driving through Mississippi at the time when our car started having issues and overheating. Thankfully, we were near an exit, so we got off the freeway with our hazards on, slowly drove into the closest parking lot of a Sonic, and turned the car off. We had to figure out what was wrong with our car, and most likely without moving it, so we got directions to a nearby gas station and started walking. I was so incredibly thankful it was September, so it wasn't very hot. On our way there, we noticed what looked like this big old house with a fenced-in yard, till we started looking at it more. It was actually an old church that looked like it had been closed or abandoned for a while. At that moment, we could read each other's minds. We knew we were going to be staying in this little town for the night. We got to the gas station where they thankfully sold antifreeze and started our walk back. On our way, we looked around to see if there was anyone watching, we checked for no trespassing signs, and looked for the best ways in. However, the best way in would turn out to be the front gate that didn't have a lock or a sign on it. Once we got back to our car, we poured in the antifreeze and thankfully that seemed to help. We decided to eat while we were there and then left to find a good place to leave the car while we went exploring. Turns out there was a small motel not far off from the church, so we agreed to park there. It was already evening when we first pulled into Sonic, so we didn't have to wait much longer till it got dark. Once we were good and didn't see anyone loitering around the motel, I emptied my purse, so all I had on me was my pepper spray and a flashlight, and we left. As we walked to the church, we opened the gate and quickly ran up to the door to get in. The door looked like someone did a poor attempt at boarding it up, but missed one whole side of the frame, as we could easily slip through and inside. Once in, I immediately noticed how creepy the main hall was. There was spray paint on the walls that said, "Welcome." It looked like someone had taken the boards that covered the windows and made a sign that, again, said something like, "She welcomes all here." Weird, but probably people that snuck in trying to make a church creepier than they are. We walked over to the right that had a couple of rooms. It looked like it was for children based on the decorations and bright colored paint that was peeling from the walls. The first room seemed to have a really old TV in it, but the actual center of it was busted out. There were a few toys in a small chest in the back, as well as a little cubby shelf with different names on it. Don't get me wrong, I love doing this, but seeing places like this with a name attached to it gives me a weird feeling. It makes it more real or brings it back to life in a sense. I proceeded down to the next room, which was then when things started to get weird. The room had been stripped. The cubbies and shelves on the wall had been ripped out. The light fixtures and wiring seemed completely gone. The carpet had started being ripped up where it could be, leaving the bare wooden floor underneath. But the creepy part was in the middle of the room. There was a pile of toys, or rather, things. More specifically, it looked like anything with a face. Dolls, cars with faces, VHS tapes with faces on it, the clock with literal hands in it and eyes, all anything you could think of. However, it was all red. It looked like someone had poured buckets of red paint on the stuff and just left it. I thought that, once again, it was just someone trying to be creepy, so I just left. As Omar and I started walking to check out the other side, we could smell something that was like an incense or a candle. Going further in the hallway, though, we couldn't smell it, and we definitely couldn't smell it on the other side either. Curious to know what it was, though, we decided to go to the only other place left, which appeared to be the main chapel area. We slowly creaked the doors open and went in cautiously. This is where we became a little more on alert. At the altar, we could see what looked like lit candles. Omar was hesitant to continue at first, worried someone could be in here, but it wasn't that big and I couldn't see anyone from where I was, so we agreed to walk further in together. As we did, I started to notice weird symbols on the walls, and they appeared to be written in red paint, just like the room we first saw. Omar then pointed at the pews that also had the symbols all over them. I was starting to get some weird vibes from this place at this point. I had never seen these symbols before. I was far from being well versed in different religions, but these seemed more cryptic. However, the altar is where I waved the flag. From the entrance, I could see the candles, but couldn't really make out anything else up there. Once we approached it, there was a pew that was up there, but still facing the same way. I was startled at first because there was a tarp over it, and it looked like someone was under it. Omar softly kicked the pew to see if whatever was under there would budge. When nothing happened, he slowly pulled the tarp back. I almost got sick. It looked like a pig that had been dead for a very long time, which explained why we couldn't really smell anything. But the podium had a disturbing framed picture on it. It was a naked woman that looked like she had a long cut from her neck to her belly button. She looked like she was sitting on one of these very pews, legs straight down and crossed at the ankles, an arm stretched out across the backrest. However, she was alive and smiling. The podium also had what we were smelling. It was an incense that was almost out, and the candles we saw were those fake battery ones. At this point, we were more than on edge. This meant someone had to have been here, and recently. Omar didn't want to stick around anymore, and I certainly didn't want to get to know anyone that did this, so we bounced. We quickly, and as quietly as we could, went right back out the front door. Omar had me go out the door first, and when I turned back to hold the board open some, I noticed he was looking to the left. I told him to come on when he finally walked out and pushed me towards the gates. Once we got out, we took off to our car, and when I thought we were just going to chill for a bit, he actually drove off. He said he would feel more comfortable if we got away from there. He didn't talk much while we were driving, so I did a lot of the talking, trying to make jokes about what we saw to lighten the mood. I think we went a few more exits before we ended up at another hotel. After we slept that night and headed off the next morning, it was at that time he finally told me what was wrong. He thought he had heard a noise when we were leaving, and when he looked over, he saw a man in a dark blue parka-looking thing holding a huge knife, just watching us leave. He wasn't comfortable staying there in case they came looking for us, so that's why we left. He hadn't said anything to me because he didn't want me to be worried. I was okay with that too. I felt bad that he had to carry that on his own, but I am thankful he was watching out for us. We still like to do this, and it hasn't stopped us, but if we see something even remotely off, it's not worth a risk, so we just leave. Thankfully, we haven't run into any more pigs since. One of my friends and I used to get together at least once a month and go hiking in one of the forests near us. We even made a few trips into a local national park because we wanted to get through all of the trails. The one by us has a few different paths in it that can take some time to get through, so we dedicate each trip to one path. However, that's also because we tend to divert off that trail so we can get away from the groups of people and tourists and actually look around and enjoy the view. This event actually occurred one of those times we were going through that very park. We gathered our normal bag of gear that we took with us, like water, a couple of snacks, a few emergency items like a small knife, first aid kit, things like that, and met up at the park. I typically left my cell phone in my car because once we got deep in the trees, it was worthless anyways. My friend Troy, though, always kept his on him even though he had the same result. So we got there and started heading out to the last path we hadn't tried before. This one was a bit more of an incline, so we found ourselves taking a few extra breaks on our way through. It was also towards the beginning of summer and was super humid that day, so I know that was probably part of it. So we stopped and waited for people to pass and looked around to try and find a good place to divert from the path. We finally found one as we estimated where the lake would run and decided we wanted to head towards that. We walked over by some trees, past a pile of dead branches and other debris, and were now no longer in view of the path. The trees provided us some shade too, which made it a little easier on us as well. I don't feel like it was long after this point that we ended up running into this guy. We were laughing and joking about something, and we were pretty loud about it when I saw this guy just standing in front of this tree. I nudged my friend to get their attention, and they stopped and looked at them with me. The guy didn't even look back at us, and the way he was dressed was even more bizarre to me. He had on one of those thick, puffy jackets with some really dirty and ripped up jeans. He also had some long hair that looked like it hadn't been brushed in a while, as you could see the huge knot in the back of it. I didn't know what to do, so I just apologized for disrupting him, and when he still said nothing or looked over, I motioned for my friend to walk around him so we could keep going. As we did, I looked back to see his face and noticed it looked just as dirty. But it was the look on his face that confused me even more. He looked very cross, like he was trying to remember something or was extremely angry about something. Curious to know if he really was mad or possibly injured or lost, I asked him if he was okay and didn't get a response. As my friend was telling me not to, I decided to approach him and get a better look at him. Still, he did not take his angry look off the tree in front of him. When I got closer, I also noticed that the dirt on his face looked flaky, like it was dried blood. So I again asked him if he was okay and if he needed any help. Still nothing. My friend kept saying we needed to go and that he was freaking him out, but part of me didn't feel right leaving him. So I pulled out my extra bottle of water and a bag of trail mix and set it next to the tree. As I started walking back, that's when I heard the guy mumbling something, so I turned back around, thinking he was talking to me. He was just mumbling a bunch of nonsense though, as I couldn't make out anything he was saying, so I just continued walking back to my friend when he finally said something coherent. Not that it made any sense though. He said, "Tell me, Tell me your secrets. Me. What? Him, still staring at the tree. He has secrets. Tell me your secrets. My friend was about ready to leave my ass at this point, so I just turned back and we made a brisk walk away from him. I looked back a few times and he never moved, so we carried on. After a bit of time, we finally got through the trees and we didn't quite make it to the lake, but did find a little offshoot stream of some sort. We sat there for a few, splashed water on our faces, and just chilled for a bit. We noticed the orange and pink in the sky and knew we needed to start heading back, so we started making our way out. As we were walking, I was curious if that guy was still there, so I could report it to someone to let them know, because that definitely wasn't normal, and he probably needed help. I know we took either the same path back or pretty close to it based on the trail of flat grass and dirt we left, so it wasn't hard to trace our steps back, and we definitely found the guy. But he was far from okay. As we approached, it looked like he had his hands on the side of the tree, and we could hear grunts or mumbling as we approached. Again, my friend stayed back while I got closer, and this guy was seriously smashing his head into this same tree, repeatedly. There was blood all over his face, his hands, and chest. You could see the blood dripping on his shirt and coat, getting caked into his beard, and on the ground in front of him. On top of this, he was now screaming, "Tell me why! Tell me why! What are you hiding?" Over and over with every smash. While this is happening, my friend is yelling behind me, "What the hell are you doing? Don't touch him. What's wrong with him?" And I'm trying to figure out what to do. If this guy doesn't stop soon, he's going to cause some serious damage and even kill himself. I decided to basically pummel him, but it didn't even faze him. He started crawling back to the tree to keep going. I told my friend to run back to get help because I didn't want to leave him alone, but I wasn't going to be able to stop him and make him come with us. My friend didn't waste any time though, and he took off back towards the trails. I tried a few times pulling him away from the tree, but every time he would make his way back to it. With how many times I repeated this insane process, it seemed like my friend got back at record speed. Thankfully, he was accompanied by a park ranger who was able to subdue him enough to get some ties on his wrist and get him to sit on the ground. From there though, he just rocked back and forth, sitting on the ground as he screamed and cried. Some police showed up too, and we gave them our statement and had to try to convince them that we had nothing to do with him except trying to save his life. And then we were finally allowed to leave. We wanted to see what happened with the guy though, so we sat in my car and waited to see him come out. When they came down to the entrance, the guy was sitting in the back of one of those little trailers the rangers drove around, and he looked out of it. I don't know what happened to him from that point on though. The only other update we got was when a detective called me and asked if I saw anyone else with him, and he mentioned because they had found other items indicating there may have been someone with him. I did tell them that I had left food and water there for them, and even mentioned the brand so they knew, and they said that's not what they meant, and explained that they had found some clothing and a note. They wouldn't give more information than that, so I assume it's probably important, or serious maybe, but I saw nothing else there. So yeah, that was the last time I saw that guy, obviously, and the last time I was ever approached about it, other than when my friend brought it up to remember or tell someone about it. We did go back to that trail that same month, I think it was about 2 weeks after, to see if we could find anything else to tell us what the hell happened. The trail, of course, was different due to new growth, but once we got around the general area, the tree was easy to spot. The tree had bark missing, and there was a gouge in it. It was at the perfect height for someone to be smashing their head into it. It was eerie seeing it, standing right where he was, racking my brain as to what was going on in his head. That was the last time we took that path. My friend thought it was too messed up to look at anymore, so we never went back. I know it's entirely possible the guy was just messed up and there was nothing else to it other than he just needed help, but that is just a scene I can never get out of my head. I've worked at a locally owned liquor store for quite a while. In fact, I'm almost at a decade working there. I started back when I was 21, and I'm about to be 30. If there's something I can tell you about working at a liquor store, they are crazy people magnets, and those crazy people like to come out at night. When they come out, they crave alcohol, and the only thing standing between them and what they want is at that point me. So that said, I could probably fill out an entire novel with the weird people I've encountered and the crazy situations I've been in. However, just for the sake of brevity, I'll just talk about one customer in particular. He was a decent guy. There was just one instance that genuinely freaked me out. A bit of backstory to how he came to be a customer. About 2 years into my working there, the store actually changed its hours to be open later because the state or county, not sure which, had approved extended hours for liquor stores. Because of this, we went from closing at 9 p.m. to closing at midnight. I was cool with working the late shifts, so I got put on the closing, and for the most part, everything was okay. That was until the new hours attracted a very particular man. We're going to call this man Daryl. Daryl was a very strange guy that was very, very open about the things in his life to people that he barely knew. The first night that he came in, he grabbed a large handle off the shelf, came up to the register, and looked me dead in the eyes. And when I say dead in the eyes, I mean that he seriously looked dead, and he stared at me with a seriously cold and aggressive glare. I was taught from a young age that you should be nice to people you don't know, because you never know what they're going through. So I looked at him back and asked how he was doing on that fine evening. As soon as I said that, he said back in practically a whisper, "Don't talk." After about 10 or 20 agonizingly silent and awkward seconds, he smiled and said something to the effect of, "All right, you're pure." At first I thought his "don't talk" statement was the start of a robbery, like he was about to pull a gun or something, but then he gave me this half-toothless grin, and it kind of put my mind at ease. I rang him up and we moved on. Then the next time he came in, I asked what the whole "you're pure" thing was about. He smiled at me and said that he had a gift that, if he stared into your eyes long enough, he could tell if you were a good person or not. I jokingly asked him what he would have done if his gift had told him I wasn't a good person, and he said, "Oh, well, I probably would have killed you." This may sound like something that would be said by someone that's making a joke or something, but the tone he had sent chills down my spine. I could tell that this man was not joking. He shrugged and then followed up with, "But we don't have to worry about that because you're pure. I can tell you won't be a problem for me." After this night, he came in several times over a few months, and for the most part, the conversations were normal. Well, as normal as they could be with him. He would talk about his job as a janitor, though he wouldn't tell me where he worked, and said it was top secret. He told me about his friends that he went to Iraq with. He would tell me about the ones that didn't make it back. Every once in a while, the short conversations would be broken by him making a really hard grimace and looking away, which told me that he had some internal issues that he was facing. Because of this, I was always polite to him, and I made it a point to keep the conversations as light as I could. There was one night where he came into the store in his underwear and paid in cash. You can guess where he was keeping it. Honestly, that was the night that I almost checked out of this whole thing. But he was incredibly apologetic, and he told me that he forgot his pants. That's it. He had apparently simply forgotten to put pants on. Like I said, it was weird, but I let it go and we moved forward. The aforementioned event that this story is actually about took place around 6 months into Daryl being a regular, almost every other day kind of customer. He and I had built quite the rapport. Hell, after the underwear thing, I would say that we were almost friends even. He had told me all about his time in the military. He had mentioned a few crazy things that he was researching, and he had even told me that he had a son somewhere out there that he hadn't seen for nearly a decade. One night in the fall, probably sometime around October or November, he came into the store and he had a look about him that I hadn't seen before. When I noticed that he seemed off, I said, "Hey, Daryl, you okay, buddy? You aren't looking too good." As soon as I asked him this, his face turned beet red, and he grabbed one of the bottles off the shelf and chucked it straight at me. It hit the shelf and shattered, knocking several things down in the process. At that moment, I was seriously confused and scared. This guy had always seemed a bit out there, but this level of violence wasn't like him. I was standing in the corner, petrified, and trying to process what exactly was happening. And Daryl was standing near the shelf, smashing bottle after bottle and screaming about something that honestly made no sense. He was screaming about how everything in his life was going to hell, about how everyone that he knew was out to kill him. He started listing off what I'm assuming were events of things going wrong in his life. Then he started screaming at me and asking if I was in on it. He was adamant that someone out there was trying to, quote unquote, ruin everything in his life that he had worked so hard for. So at this point, it's 11 at night in this small town. I'm standing behind the counter with my back against the wall and my shoes covered in liquor and shards of glass. There were no other customers in the store. There were no other employees there to help me, as I was the only closer. All the while, this guy that I was sort of acquainted with from his times buying alcohol at our store was shouting every kind of violent profanity at me and was starting to convince himself that, for some reason, I was one of the bad guys out to get him. He starts in on how the government has been trying to find him and that the only person he talks to is me. So the fact that they found him meant I was the one telling them information. Obviously, I had no clue what the hell he was going on about, but I was scared. I wasn't sure how far he was going to take it. Thankfully, while I was paralyzed, the owner of the neighboring gas station had apparently called the police. I guess he heard the screaming and the glass shattering because after about 5 minutes of enduring the insanity that was unraveling before me, I heard the door opening and the sound of an officer screaming, "Get on the ground." Daryl actually started to turn his anger toward them for a moment, but I think the weight of the situation may have dawned on him, or he came back to reality, because he started sobbing and quickly got on the ground. After the insanity finally came to an end, the owner of the store showed up and asked me, alongside the police, what happened. I told them I didn't know. I told them everything I knew about Daryl, and that he just showed up enraged and started trashing the store. I felt bad, honestly. It was midnight, and this poor guy had clearly had an episode. After all was said and done, I found out that Daryl actually did have a few mental issues. and he was apparently off his meds for a while. On top of that, he wasn't supposed to be drinking while taking his medication, so it was a recipe for something to go wrong. Like I said though, he was fairly normal for most of our interactions, but this one night he had apparently snapped, and I had just said the wrong thing to him. My manager and I talked about the situation, and he decided to not press charges against Daryl so long as he could pay for what it was destroyed. I actually pitched in for half of it. I think it was something like $150. Sadly, Daryl only came in one more time, and he actually did so to apologize to me personally. He said that he has issues and that he didn't mean to scare me. I told him that I understood, shook his hand, and that was the last time he and I ever interacted. I personally just hope he's doing all right. As a child, I was raised in a small, tight-knit town. I hated it. Everyone knew you, and there was no such thing as a secret. If you tell one person, you will hear it from someone else in 2 days tops. I had a group of 4 or 5 friends max that I might share things with that I could actually trust. Hell, some things I couldn't even tell my little sister without getting something on her. Otherwise, we'd just use it as leverage on each other. That's what makes this situation even crazier to me. Our school classes were pretty normal, in curriculum and size, in my opinion. We had maybe 10 to 15 of us in a classroom. No one outside of our town was interested in going to our school, and as soon as they were given the opportunity, kids in high school that had cars would get to choose to go to school outside of our district to get out of here, or people would move out before then. I was not so lucky. My family was far from wealthy, so we stayed in our town till I was old enough to move out. Anyways, back to the classes. Obviously, being a teenager, relationships are bound to happen. There weren't many to choose from, and some may have even been a year younger or older than you. I dated a few different girls, but there was one I was with for about 2 years. For privacy reasons, I'll call her Macy. From the outside, Macy was a fun girl to be around. She was tall, about shoulder-length dark hair and dark brown eyes with freckles. She could talk to anyone. She was definitely outgoing, and I never really saw a mean side to her. I think she would strive to be everyone's friend. She was just part of our group of friends for the longest time. She wore makeup and dressed more feminine, but also loved going down by the river with me and a few of our friends to catch things, destroy things, and maybe even enjoy some drinking. It was over the summer that I really got to know her more. I knew her dad was a drunk and her mom worked a lot, so she didn't see them much. She came over to our house a lot for dinner and sometimes even slept in our living room. There was one time that she had gotten into an argument with her father. He had grabbed her and started choking her when her mother finally convinced him to let her go. However, her mother told her it was best for her to leave for a while. She came over in tears and I helped calm her down, and I think that really solidified our relationship in a weird way. I was angry. My parents weren't perfect, but they never hurt us kids. How could a parent do that to their own child? It was worse when the cops showed up and did absolutely nothing. They showed up to their house, took him in. He said he was sorry and was able to come home after sobering up. Like that changed anything, though. She practically lived with us at times. She slept on the couch. Sometimes she'd fall asleep in my room and I'd sleep in the living room. We acted like a normal couple for the most part, hanging out with friends together, always walking to class together, things like that. But after a while, I started seeing a different side of her. I noticed some of the smallest things would set her off. If a friend teased her about something, like throwing a ball weird, and I didn't immediately defend her, she would be pissed. It started as her just ignoring me for the rest of the night. Then she would complain to me in private about how she was embarrassed. But then it started to become more public. She would call me out in front of our friends and even my parents and then storm off. This was my first real relationship, so I didn't really know how to react to it. I'd go through the motions, apologize, and make up, and we'd be fine. However, it always seemed to get worse. The more serious fights would happen when it was just us. She'd kick things, punch things, scream if she could, and sometimes would even hit me. It was usually just punching me in the chest or smacking me in the face, but it was still unusual. I thought surely it had to do with her father being the person he was. Maybe this is what she did because she was used to it. So I would do what I could to calm her down, but it stopped working after a while. I would have to lock her out of my room, or I would leave until she calmed down. But, of course, that's when the accusations would fly. She would start getting loud and push me while at school, and it was embarrassing for me at that point, so I would just walk away. For some reason, when I did this, she thought I was trying to hide from my other girlfriend. She started accusing me of cheating on her, and she'd always show up at the door of my classroom and wait to see if I walked out with another girl. We had a group project in one of my classes, and I was paired with my friend Jeff and some girl that I didn't know too well. When I was leaving the room, she punched me in the face and started saying she finally caught me. I remember the girl just looking horrified as she tried leaving without Macy noticing her. People were starting to gather, but she had her eyes locked on and jumped on this girl's back and started slamming her around. I managed to get her off of the girl and told her we were done. I remember I called her psycho or something equally hurtful because the look in her eyes changed to sorrow and she ran off. I, of course, got called to the office and had to explain what happened. Macy ended up being expelled. I told them it was my fault, hoping the other girl wouldn't get into any trouble, and I ended up being suspended for the quarter. I finished my suspension, as awkward as it was, and returned to school to be the center of discussion for everyone. I didn't get to hear much on what happened to Macy, except for what my friends knew, which wasn't much. I heard her parents were forced to put her in therapy and possibly some kind of school for troubled teens, but I never saw her again. That happened about 18 years ago. Right after high school, I left that town. I wanted to go somewhere that was a lot more alive and meet people I hadn't known my whole life. My sister and I even inspired our parents to get out of there a few years ago. However, they still surprise me with the amount of information, news, and gossip they tell me about people that live there. That's where it gets crazy. Around the time of our 10-year high school reunion, people started contacting me about getting together. I thought, why the hell not? And decided to start making plans to visit. However, a few weeks after that, I got a frantic call from my mom late at night telling me there had been a fire in our old town. She told me it was Macy's house, and the terrifying part, her parents died in that fire. My father was good friends with one of the cops there, and he had told him that Macy was still living there on and off, but she was working the night it happened, and they had to go pick her up. After the investigation, they had determined that her dad had passed out with a cigarette. He was blitzed, of course, and her mom had actually taken sleeping pills. It was just a bad situation, and I felt sorry for her. I almost wanted to reach out to her, maybe to at least give my condolences, but something told me not to. My mother went to the services, and she said Macy was just a shell. She just sat in the front pew, staring straight ahead until the services ended. Afterwards, she said she was nowhere to be found, so my mother had left her a card and other items and just left. After that, I never heard about Macy or her life until last year. This time, my friend actually texted me and sent me a link to the local news for our old town. It started as a suspicious fire. Police were called to an old barn that was on fire behind one of the bars. Someone apparently walked out back, smelled the smoke, saw the flames between the trees that separated the property, and called 911. After they put out the fire, they found a man's body in there. He had been stabbed multiple times, bludgeoned with a shovel, and doused in some kind of oil and set on fire. They couldn't ID the guy because he didn't have anything on him. That was crazy enough, right? Not at all. Not for that place. Rumors started flying pretty quickly. People started talking, but not to the police, but that didn't stop them from finding out. That's when my friend started filling in the blanks, where the story left off. He still lives there. He actually took over his parents' truck store, so he gets just as much information. The guy ended up being identified as the owner of the bar. They figured this out because his wallet was found in the dumpster at his bar, but his cash was missing. Coincidentally, someone showed up at a different bar flaunting cash and buying everyone drinks, saying it was in this guy's honor. Thing is, they hadn't publicly announced this guy's identity, so the police took notice of this. The girl was picked up and questioned when she finally confessed to the murder. You know where this is going. It was Macy. She was apparently dating the owner, or at least there was something going on between them. However, he was married. Rumors were that the wife found out, the owner tried to break it off with Macy, and she wasn't having it. Now that she is locked up for this, the rumors are coming back that she may have been involved in her parents' deaths. So, not only did I date a not-so-stable girl in high school, but she turned out to be a murderer, so I guess I got lucky at the time. But it does make me think what could have happened if I did reach out to her when her parents passed. What if we didn't move? Could I have been a victim? I also think if this was related to her childhood, and if that could have made a difference as well. One thing I told my friend though is that he'll have to come see me from now on because I do not want to step back in that town. This story isn't mine personally. I'm not the type of person to go out on the deep web for any reason. This story actually happened to a coworker and good friend of mine. I made sure he was okay with me sharing the story, and he said it was fine. For the sake of privacy and security, we're going to refer to him as Ron. Ron's a good guy, probably one of the nicest people I ever met, and he really didn't deserve the situation that happened to him. I will say that I've known him for a few years now, and I completely believe everything he's told me about this. Several years ago, Ron lived in a comfortable suburban home with his lovely wife of 10 years, and for the sake of security, we're going to call her Karen. Ron and Karen had a 7-year-old daughter at the time of the story, and everything seemed all right. Ron had a good job and made more money than they actually needed. Karen was a stay-at-home mom that took care of their daughter when she was home and ran the various errands while she was at school, pretty much doing the basics of what a stay-at-home parent does. Ron was under the impression that their marriage was in a good position. He loved Karen as much as he always had. He loved his daughter more than life itself. They had a nice house in a nice neighborhood, and they had enough money to take care of any financial emergencies if they needed it. To the best of Ron's knowledge, they were all happy and healthy. He didn't think anything was wrong at home. Karen, on the other hand, was apparently very unhappy with their marriage and was determined to leave Ron and run off with some guy that she had met online and been talking to around a year. Karen and her internet boyfriend had apparently spent a lot of time plotting and spoke extensively how they could follow through with what they had planned and what would be the best way to get the deed done. At one time, they even discussed the possibility of internet boyfriend driving from his home in Nebraska and doing it himself, saying that he could make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Apparently, this would have been too personal, and they opted to look on the dark web for someone to remove her husband from the equation. Then she would wait long enough to bury him, collect insurance, and pretend to grieve. After a few months, she planned to then take her daughter and the money from his life insurance and run off with the boyfriend to start their new life up north. Based on the conversations, she was adamant that it needed to look like an accident. That way the life insurance would pay out the maximum. Like I said, Ron made good money and was worth a decent amount dead. So she planned to live a few years off of that with the new guy. Back to their actual plan, as I said, they had the intent of going on the dark web and finding, basically, a hitman to get rid of her husband. Apparently, they were successful to an extent. They got on the deep web, they found a site that listed people providing these services, and they got the information for someone that they were going to pay to do the entire thing. They even went as far as sending the $15,000 to the account of the person that was supposed to do the job. Thankfully for Ron, his wife and her new boyfriend were not well versed in how things worked on the dark web, and to some extent, were kind of stupid. Apparently, they went all the way through the plotting with this person, sent him the money, and even set a date. On the date in question, Karen had taken her daughter to her grandparents' house and had told Ron that she was going to spend the day with them. While she was gone, Ron got a visit by the local police and a federal agent. They explained the situation to him and basically took him into protective custody. When Karen got home, she expected to find her husband lying dead on the living room floor, but instead had federal agents screaming at her and taking her to the ground. What's worse, she apparently had brought their daughter home with her, meaning she would have been okay with the little girl seeing her dead father. Based on what Ron was told, the police had all of the information on the conversation, the connection logs from when she was on the page, emails from her to the fake hitman, and enough evidence to put her away for a long time. Apparently, she was so desperate to get rid of him that she was able to be talked into sending the money over PayPal. She literally sent $15,000 on a credit card over PayPal to have her husband murdered. I don't know if she was just ignorant or if she just wanted it done and wasn't going to question the situation. Thankfully, for Ron's sake, she had gotten a hold of a sting on the site, and she was taken down without issue. The boyfriend was also arrested, and they were charged for conspiracy to commit murder, and probably a few other charges, but they were both sentenced to 20 years in prison for their plans. Ron has since remarried, and his daughter is old enough to understand what her mother did. But he says that he got lucky with all this, and I agree. If his wife had gone to another page, been a little more competent, and paid a little more attention to being secure in her messaging and communications, Ron may have been legitimately murdered that day, and she would be off living with her internet boyfriend in the Dakotas. The town I grew up in is considered to be a fairly small town overall. It's basically made up of continuations of previous generations, and while they have recently got a Sonic's Drive-In and a Dollar General, it is still and forever will be a super small town in north central Colorado. Most people think of Denver when you mention the area, but we're actually a solid hour and a half away. I spent most of my life in the arms of what was basically the middle of nowhere, but unlike the rest of my graduating class of like 30, I ended up moving out further west when I hit 20. So I know both sides of life, this tiny town that no one's heard of, and the big city out on the coast. What's weird, life in the small town is actually more terrifying, in my opinion. Sure, living in Cali, you may get robbed or accosted by someone on some sort of substance, but at least you can expect it. For some reason, learning about the horrors of your hometown tends to blindside you, or at least it did me. I don't know, maybe not all small towns have secrets that they hold on to like mine did, or maybe they do. My hometown actually had a few things that everyone knew about, but no one spoke about. Some of them happened in my grandparents' time, some in my parents', but they were some of the best kept secrets around, honestly. The main thing I learned was that I apparently had an aunt at one point. Back when I was about 15, my grandma accidentally slipped up and called me Nance. My name is certainly not Nance, Nancy, or any variation of that. I asked her who Nance was, and I remember when I asked her, she looked like she was about to seriously burst into tears. She said that she couldn't tell me, but that I should ask my father about it. I honestly had no idea who they were, nor did I expect what my dad told me. Apparently, Nancy, lovingly referred to as Nance by my grandma, was my aunt, my father's older sister. This took me by surprise, as I never knew I had a paternal aunt. I thought my father was an only child, mostly because I had never seen a photo of this woman, never heard her name mentioned, and I had never spoken to her. Obviously, I was curious about who she was, where she was, and why she hadn't been around. And I wish I had quelled that curiosity because it was pretty horrible. I was informed that back when my father was 12 and my Aunt Nancy was 14, she had apparently gone missing. There was one night back then that she went out with her friends and she just never came home. At first, my grandma thought it wasn't a big deal. She was just out there and being stupid. But then, by morning, it was apparent to her that something had gone wrong. He told me that my aunt was a straight A student and would have likely graduated valedictorian, but that night she seemingly vanished. This was obviously creepy to me. I had never expected to have an aunt that was a missing person. Then he told me that she wasn't a missing person. She was murdered. He went on to tell me that when she went missing, the whole town went into what was essentially a small town lockdown. They put a curfew into effect, and every adult was on the lookout for Nancy. They seriously combed every inch of the city and spoke to everyone they could to see if anyone had known of her whereabouts. They had spoken to the friends that my aunt had gone out with, and they all told the same story. They were out basically loitering wherever, and a police officer pulled up with his lights on. They said that the officer rolled down the window and called out to Nancy, and she ran over to speak to the officer. Apparently, she then turned around, yelled that she needed to go, then got in the car, and that was it. The biggest issue with this is that not a single one of her friends had seen his face. None of them could describe him at all, and there were no details on the car that made it stand out, and none of them had gotten a plate. A year after she had disappeared, everyone had pretty much given up on ever finding her alive, when someone actually ended up finding what looked like a shallow grave in a creek bed that had receded. The police came out and dug it up, and as you can probably guess, they found the body of my aunt. Based on how she was buried, they assumed that she was essayed and the cause of death was strangulation. At this point, The only thing anyone knew was that the last person to see her alive was a police officer, but there was literally no information on who it was. Then he explained that not long after they found her body, two police officers resigned from the force. One of them had a daughter of his own and was married, and the other was just the opposite, single and no kids. The one with the family left town. No one has any idea where he went. The other officer actually became the physical education teacher at the high school I graduated from, and was also the football coach. I saw this man almost every day for 4 years, and every single day after this, I had to think that he may have seriously assaulted and murdered my aunt. The worst part, there's no way that we'll ever know what actually happened to her, mostly because of how much damage had been done to her body over the year. There was no physical evidence, no DNA that they could find, no prints or anything like that. Just a dead girl and silent suspicions. Apparently, the entire town, for lack of a better word, knew that these two were involved. The timing was too suspicious, and it was apparently believed that their higher-ups may have been aware of the situation. But like I said, nothing ever happened to them. One is gone, and the other still teaches high school gym class. Honestly, it was just one more reason to get the hell out of there when I got the chance to do so. About 20 years ago, I had some pretty sudden life changes and ended up renting a house in a small suburban neighborhood. It was nice. It was a major change for me, and I would say that it was peaceful, a fresh start. The house was charming, not too big, had a comfortable little yard, and I knew the person that was renting it out, so it wasn't too expensive. As comfortable as it was, I will say that some of the neighbors were a bit out there. The majority of them were kind people, but some of them were nosy. One neighbor in particular, Mr. Weller, was a very confusing individual. He lived in the house directly across from mine, and the day I moved in, I saw him standing outside on his front porch, just sipping on a glass of tea and watching me. He waved, he seemed friendly, but we didn't talk, so the only knowledge I had of him was that he lived there and was willing to wave at a neighbor that was outside. I didn't see him for a couple days after that, but about a week or so later, when I had gotten home from work, I felt eyes stabbing me when I was walking up to my house. I turned around to see who was staring at me, and I noticed Mr. Weller standing at his front window and just staring. He wasn't trying to hide the fact that he was staring. He was clearly watching me with an unreadable expression. I waved, thinking maybe he was just lost in thought and didn't realize he was staring, but he didn't wave back or blink even. He just held that same deadpan stare. I felt a bit unnerved about the whole thing. I quickly made my way inside, but the eerie feelings didn't stop there. When I'd come home from work or a jog, he would be there, staring at me. When I would step out to get the mail, he would be there at his window. If he was outside doing something like mowing the lawn and I went outside, he would stop doing whatever he was doing, go back inside, and stare at the window until I went back inside. Then it got worse. Sometimes, whenever I would go inside from doing whatever I would need to do, my landline would ring, but when I'd answer it, the person would just hang up. No breathing, no voice, just me saying, "Hello?" and then a click as they hung the call up. I couldn't prove who it was. The caller ID would show blocked, but I had this weird feeling that it was Mr. Weller. I had no idea what I had done wrong, or if I had done something that made him hate me. But clearly, this man had something against me. I called up the person that owned the house. They were friends of my mother's, So I had their number and I asked her if she'd ever had any troubles with Mr. Weller. She told me that she hadn't personally, but I was only the second person to rent the house, but the other tenant hadn't mentioned any issues. So by this point, I knew it was just me. After a while, it started to get to me. The incessant staring, the silent calls, it actually made me feel paranoid. I would actively avoid going outside so that I didn't have to see him standing there and staring at me. I stopped going for my jogs, and when I got home from work, I would just go straight to the house without turning around. I would get the mail every few days to avoid having to walk to the end of the street. It hit a point where I would wake up thinking that he was staring in my windows, literally just paranoid. Then I hit my limit. I went outside to get my mail one day, and sure enough, he was there at the window, staring daggers at me. My paranoid shifted to rage, and I started walking toward Mr. Weller's house. I hate confrontation, but I was done with all of this. As I was walking to the house, I watched Mr. Weller pull the curtains closed and retreat into the house, but I wasn't going to just let it go. I stepped on his porch and I banged on the door, probably harder than I should have. After a few seconds of waiting for him to answer the door, part of me was actually more angry at the possibility of him being a coward and not answering. Then the door unlocks and opens, and the person that answered was not Mr. Weller. A frail older woman opened the door and looked at me with a big smile and asked how she could help me. I was a bit confused. I'd never seen this woman. I mentioned that I was looking to speak with Mr. Weller, and she looked at me a bit like she was upset at my request. She then hits me with, "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. My brother Kennedy passed away a few months ago. I've been living here for a few months now." I had no idea what to say, but after a few moments she smiled again and said, "Were you close?" I shyly just kind of shook my head and mentioned that I was a neighbor and that I was sorry for her loss. She thanked me and I awkwardly made my exit out of the conversation, feeling like a total idiot. I was walking back to my house, just thinking about how creepy it was that he was dead, and had been for a few months. I got chills thinking about how I would see him staring at me from the window, even though he was gone. Then I stopped and it hit me that this was all a load of BS, and that I had literally seen him mowing the lawn the day before. I turned and looked back at their house, and sure enough, he was there at the window staring at me. I actually laughed as I went inside. This jerk was such a coward and was so unwilling to face me after being a creep for so long that he had whoever that woman was, his sister or wife or whatever, lie and tell me he was dead. After that, the staring and calls actually stopped. He never bothered me again, and I would see him outside doing whatever he would do, and I would wave at him anytime we made eye contact, mostly to taunt him, and he would just scowl and turn away. In the end, I don't know what the hell Mr. Weller's problem was. I don't know what I did to make him dislike me, and I do not know why he was such a creep, but I was thankful it all stopped. I only lived in that house for another year, and the whole time, I never spoke to him, or that woman, and I never had any other problem. I've only had one bad experience with the deep web, and it was way more than enough in my personal opinion. I'm not an overly technical person. I am not a tech genius. I'm no hacker extraordinaire. But I do know my way around the internet, and I have an understanding of what indexing and non-index pages, deep web, actually are. I took a few classes on internet security, and there were a couple sections dedicated to deep web and dark web, or at least explaining what they were, how the technology worked, like onion routing and encryption, and I felt confident enough to get on the deep web and thought I could keep myself safe. And that confidence was my first mistake. But in my defense, this situation could have happened on the surface web. It just made it that much creepier that it was on the deep web. Because I wasn't interested in any of the illegal content on the dark web, I kept myself confined to the part of the deep web that were closer to the surface, basically the wading pool of the deep web. Of these pages, I mostly visited things like forums and discussion boards. I had this personal appreciation for anonymous conversations, and while I wasn't a troll or aggressive or anything, I was a bit more out with my opinion and personality, as there wasn't a name associated with the statement. Now, in order for this all to make sense, I have to explain a bit about what happened and then kind of explain the how, because it won't make sense otherwise. As stated, I spent a good amount of time on the forums. I spoke with people that I honestly considered my friends and learned a lot. It was actually kind of nice. Kind of like there was a place that I belonged, like a bar, but with text and random people that were faceless. Now, on the main forum I would use, most people signed their posts and messages with a pseudonym. Of course, there was no control over this, and anyone could use anyone else's name on their post, and no one would be the wiser. Strangely enough, it was kind of an honor system, and most people followed it. My name on the site was, ironically, No Girls on the Net. It was supposed to be a joke, a play on the claim that there are no girls on the internet, just guys pretending to be girls. This was ironic because I was a girl. Anyways, on this forum, I was fairly well known to a lot of the people in my subboards, and people would refer to me as girl. I know, not exactly specific, but typically when someone said girl, they were talking about me. Anyways, I was friends with a lot of people on this page, and they were all decent, never ran into anyone that I thought was really creepy for the most part. That all fell apart when I got a message on Facebook one day from some guy that I had never seen before named Derek. And the message just said, "Hey girl." At first, I didn't put two and two together. I thought he was just being a douche, and I told him as such. My response was simply, "What an incredibly rude and derogatory way to refer to someone. Give me one reason I should even bother responding to you beyond this." This guy responds with, "I thought that's what everyone called you. At least that's what I've always called you. You're No Girls on the Net, right?" When I read this, I was a bit freaked out. How had this person found my personal Facebook? There was absolutely no connection between me and that account, and I was always careful to not post anything that could be considered personally identifiable, and I had no idea how he could have connected the dots. I asked who he was, and he once again asked if that was my username. I didn't want to tell him yes, but I also didn't want to say anything that may indirectly confirm that it was me. So I ended up just having to say that it wasn't me, and that I hoped he found whoever it was that he was looking for. He responded with a smiley face, and then that was it for the conversation. I thought that was the end of it. I thought he had bought it, but I was wrong. I was very wrong. About a week later, I got a letter in the mail, and while this was a bit off, in today's day and age that is, I didn't think too much of it. I took it in and opened it, and then pulled out the letter. It was a printed letter that pretty much just said, "Don't lie to me, girl. I know it's you. I want to get to know you better. Here's my phone number. Shoot me a text when you get this. P.S. I will know that you got it." I was seriously freaked out. This guy was sending me letters, which meant that he knew my address. Not only that, but he claimed that he would somehow know if I got the letter and didn't tell him. How? That's when I looked over at the envelope to see if I could find a return address, and then I realized that there wasn't one. On top of that, there weren't any stamps on the envelope either, which meant that it hadn't gone through the post office. It was most likely hand delivered, which then told me how he was going to know I got it. My next mistake was calling the number. If I was going to fix this problem, I was going to have to do it head on. I pulled out my phone and called him. When he answered, he started off with, "Hey, sweetheart." I was legitimately disgusted. My response to him was, "I'm not your sweetheart. I don't even know who the hell you are. How did you find my information?" He avoided the question, but started saying that he was in love with me and that he needed me in his life. I once again told him that I had no idea who he was and that I wasn't interested. He told me to get interested or things were going to be difficult between us. I'd had enough. I told him that he was a creep and that he needed to get a life, then hung up. He tried calling me back a couple times, but I ignored it. Then he texted me, and I think I nearly pissed myself. The message that he sent me said, "You're going to love me, one way or another. Don't make me hurt you." Then followed it up with, "See you later, sweetheart." Obviously, I was panicked. This dude was a super creep and had no issue with being creepy out in the open like this. But I really didn't have much in ways of options since he hadn't actually done anything. Being a creep isn't really a crime until they escalate. Well, it escalated pretty quickly. It was actually that same night when things happened. Around 8 that evening, I heard a knock on my door. I unfortunately knew it was most likely him. I pulled the curtain open from the side window, and I saw this guy standing there in a hooded sweatshirt and black pants. Pretty obvious red flag in this case. He stood there at the door and kept knocking, then started yelling that he knew I was home. I stayed off to the side where he couldn't see me and dialed 911 on my cell phone. When they asked what the emergency was, I said, loud enough for him to hear me, that there was some creep trying to break into my house, hoping that it would be enough to get him to go away. What I didn't expect was him to smash the glass of my front door with a hammer and reach in to unlock the door. What he didn't expect was my brother, a trained police officer, to come around the corner with his gun locked on him the second he stepped into the house. As soon as my brother screamed, "Get on the ground," this guy started yelling, "Don't shoot me," and fell to his knees. My brother restrained him, and the cop showed up to arrest him. When they got him out and in the car, they came back to tell us what they had pulled off him. This dude came with zip tie cuffs, a large knife, the hammer, obviously, in a pillowcase stuffed into the hoodie pocket. Basically, it was likely that he planned to kidnap me, cuff me, put the pillowcase over my head, and take me out to his van, which he had parked just outside. In the van, they found condoms, adult toys, and various other creeper things that I don't really want to think about right now. So that's the what, but the question becomes the how. How did he find me? How did he know who I was? How did he connect my stupid username with me as a person? Easy. I was an idiot and apparently had clicked a link that he posted on the forum. This guy had linked to something on the forum page that I apparently was interested in, and it had malware that loaded into my system. Because I had some stupid software, something like JavaScript or Flash or something that was out of date, and this guy was able to drop a keylogger on my system. That, plus those fantastic little things in Chrome and Firefox that will say, save your personal info for quicker entry. Things like your address and name and all that. Yeah, that helped him tremendously. This guy had infected my system, and I had, unbeknownst to me, given him all of my personal information. Then he turned into a super creep. Like I said above, this could have technically happened on the service web. but I think it was more likely to happen on the deep web forum because I had taken my anonymity for granted. I thought I was safe. I thought I was invincible because my name was not connected to the board or the post. So take that as a lesson. Do not think that anonymity is invincibility, and make sure you update your computer. Hey everyone, I wanted to post this story up in hopes of explaining the horror that you can actually find on the dark web. Honestly, most of the things you find on the dark web aren't actually the horror movie cliche-laden websites that everyone seems to think they are. Most of the dark web is questionable or illegal adult content, people trying to buy medications illegally, etc. If you're wanting something like what you see in the movies, you have to actually know where to look, as in have the onion link. I'm not saying that those things don't exist, they just aren't easily or readily available. A lot of people tend to think it's like a dark version of Google, where you can search for crazy stuff and be given results within a few moments. It's really not. Anyways, that out of the way, I wanted to talk about a dark web experience that was honestly horrifying for my friends and I. This was several years ago. I think we were 17 at the time, and we thought we were hackers. I know it sounds stupid, but the three of us were all about the nerdy crap, Python, networking, and again, quote unquote, hacking. I'll spare myself the embarrassment in explaining all of that. Just know that we know our way around a computer. Naturally, the three of us gravitated towards places like Reddit, and then 4chan and such. I don't remember where we heard about the dark web, probably from a friend, the news, or on one of those aforementioned websites. But when we learned about the difference between surface web and dark web, our curiosity was piqued. We started looking into what it was, what was out there, and what we could do. And of course, we were enchanted with the hacker haven it was glorified to be. We thought we would get on there, look at some of the questionable sites, and be the coolest kids because we accessed content that others didn't know existed. So we did what we had to, loaded up Tor, got information for some onion links, and got ready to have our minds blown. Of course, it ended up not being as interesting as we thought it was going to be. The sites were plain and bland. We saw a couple sites selling pills, others that we didn't even bother scrolling through because of the front pages, and a few webcam sites that we honestly weren't interested in. I think all of us were getting a bit disappointed in what we were finding, though I don't know what we were expecting to find really. I think we started just clicking through and going anywhere and everywhere we could get to. Looking back, this was a really stupid idea. After clicking around for a while, we ended up on a page that looked like a little flashier than the others. I can't remember the name of the page, but I think it was something along the lines of "Your Choice" or something like that. As we started on the home screen, the whole page looked like it was a site for a butcher shop. There were a number of pictures of meat slices and cuts all over the front page, explaining the quality and what seasoning went best with each piece. Unfortunately, I think you can all see where this is going. We ended up on a page with a list of cuts, and each of them had a diagram of a person, and the part where the meat came from was highlighted. Some of what was on that page was horribly graphic, so I won't explain it in this story, but you can imagine what all was there. One of the most disturbing parts of this website was its explanation on its sourcing. I recall it explaining that all packaging would be discreet and that they would include their own seasoning packet that would go best with what you chose. What's worse, they explained that all of their meat was fresh and sourced on demand. They touted the fact that they had the ability to get everything when it was ordered. Obviously, we were freaked out by seeing this kind of meat. We got off the site and pretty much immediately removed Tor. We all kept up our pursuits in the IT world, but I don't think any of us have ever been back to the dark web since. This story takes place a few years back when myself, my sister, and her two kids were all driving to a surprise birthday party for my older brother, Matt. It was a bit of a drive, and we were actually going to be on the road for probably 10 hours heading east. But the drive was worth it because it was his first birthday back after having been deployed overseas, and he'd only been home for around a month. Basically, we knew it was going to be a pain in the ass to get all the way out to our parents' house, but it was 100% worth it to see Matt, since it had been somewhere close to a year since we last saw him. And it seemed like he should be able to celebrate his birthday with the whole family. Like I said, the drive out east was going to take around 10 hours. My sister and I were both adults, and my nieces were around 4 and 7. My sister drove for the first half, and I said I would take the second half, as I knew that at 5 hours in, she would likely be in the back seat, keeping the little ones calm and collected. 4 and 7 are old enough to enjoy these kinds of car rides, but definitely not old enough to sit for 10 hours straight. And I honestly don't blame them. If it weren't for Matt, I wouldn't have sat through this trip myself. We got through my sister's half without issue, and by the time I was getting behind the wheel, it was starting to get dark out. My sister sat in the back with the nieces, and somewhere around an hour or two into my half, she ended up falling asleep. The younger of my two nieces also fell asleep, but the older one, Courtney, was wide awake and watching all the things we were driving past. And while it may not sound like a thrilling adventure to drive with two people sleeping in the back seat and having random passing conversations with a 7-year-old, I thought it was fun. We were about an hour away from my parents' house when the actual event happened. And that's honestly what I have to call it, an event, mostly because I honestly don't know what actually happened. So, as stated, my sister and the youngest were sound asleep, and we were about 9 hours into our 10-hour drive. I was watching the highway and my speed, and just basically having a nonsense conversation with my niece. I think it was about some cartoon that she was really into at the time. As I'm watching the highway for the most part, every once in a while I glance up at the mirror and look at her. This is actually when the whole thing happened. I looked up in the mirror and said something to her. Then I glance back down and I see what I can only explain as an absolutely blinding white light. As soon as my eyes hit forward, I saw this seriously bright and all-encompassing flash of white. My first thought was that it was an oncoming car or something like that, but I just remember that immense and horrible sense of panic flooding through my body. What was weird, whatever it was, I never hit it. I thought we were going to smash into it, and I remember screaming. Hell, I even recall hearing my niece screaming, but it apparently never happened. It kind of felt like whatever that moment in time, when I saw that light, it kind of hung there for a moment, and then reset back to me on the road, driving like normal. I didn't swerve, I didn't slam my brakes. I apparently didn't scream because the other two never woke up. I went from staring down an alarmingly bright light in front of me, going 70 down the highway, certain that I was on a collision course with whatever the hell it was, to driving like normal with nothing in front of me. Of course, that feeling of terror didn't pass. I was still running high on adrenaline when I came back to reality. I pulled the car over to the side of the road and tried to take deep breaths. When I stopped the car, my sister obviously woke up, asking if we were at the hotel yet. I told her no, and that I just needed to take a moment to catch my breath. She asked if something happened, and before I could even respond, my niece starts telling her that we were talking about the cartoon, and then there was this really bright light in the middle of the road that randomly disappeared. Her vision was probably cuter and more detailed at the time. This actually made it worse though, because she confirmed what I saw. I saw all of this unfold, and she saw it too, which confirmed that I didn't fall asleep or have one of those micro nap things that you can have while driving. I legitimately saw this huge white light in the middle of the highway. Unfortunately, there was no way for me to explain the whole resetting thing, so I just left it at what she said. I told my sister that I wasn't sure what it was and that it just freaked me out a little bit. Nothing else happened the rest of the way. We all stayed awake and chatted for the last 40 minutes or so. We got there and had a great time. And while the party was certainly the highlight of the whole event, that was seriously a road trip that I'm not likely to forget anytime soon. As you are a kid, summer camp is synonymous with freedom, adventure, and summertime fun. My experience, on the other hand, is nowhere near fun. My time at the summer camp back when I was 12 years old took a horrendous turn just 3 days into camp. When I decided that I wanted to take a hike alone, a decision that quickly turned into the most painful thing I have ever gone through, the summer camp I went to was this neat little Bible-focused place in the middle of the woods, tucked away in the middle of nowhere Midwest. I had gone to this camp once prior and had no problems. This was my second time going, and because I was 12, I was part of the young teen group. This meant that during the time at the camp, we were given free days to, in their words, find ourselves and adventure into God's glory. Basically, go out into the woods with friends and enjoy nature. Now, I didn't have any friends, which meant that I did my hikes solo. Despite this, these were absolutely one of my favorite days of camp. I loved going out and identifying the plants, the birds, the bugs, and all that. They would give us a checklist that we could fill out for a prize. I never found out what that prize was because I never saw a chipmunk while I was there, which, thinking back, I guess I could have just checked it off and said that I saw one. Tangent aside, I had a great time just being out by myself. It was on one such hike that my day took a sharp turn, both literally and figuratively. Walking along the narrow dirt path, my foot got caught on a large tree root, and I was sent tumbling down into a small gully just to the side of the dirt path. It wasn't a large ditch or anything, but it was enough that the fall was definitely going to hurt. I remember feeling the dirt slip out from underneath me, getting a sudden jolt of pain, and then an overwhelming feeling of fatigue. To put it bluntly, I had fallen down and somehow hit my head and basically knocked myself out cold. When I woke up, the forest seemed really weirdly silent and like it was spinning. Dazed, I tried to piece together what exactly had happened. I was lying face down on the ground, my arm throbbing in pain. I was incredibly confused and woozy for all of 10 seconds, which is when the real pain kicked in. A burning sensation spread across my face and arm. The intensity of it was enough to make me jump up to my knees from where I was lying. I brushed my hand across my face to figure out why I was in so much agony, when I came to a horrifying realization. Fire ants. I had fallen face first into a fire ant mound. I started screaming, my shouts echoing through the woods as I jumped up and sprinted back to camp.
slapping and brushing at my face and arms in a desperate attempt to get the ants off my skin. The pain just kept feeling like it was getting worse and worse, and I just remember thinking for some reason that they were burrowing under my skin. That's how bad it hurt. When I got back to the camp, one of the counselors saw what was going on and immediately rushed me to the shower room, not wasting a moment to get my clothing off and blasting me with cold water from one of the detachable shower heads. Each and every drop of that water was a small bit of relief as it washed away the ants. I literally sobbed as I watched those little bastards go down the drain. Of course, that wasn't the end of it. I don't know if you know this, but fire ants contain a venom called piperidine. Something I looked up while I was typing this out. It's a nasty venom that, when you get too much of it in you, such as when you're stung by hundreds of these suckers, can and will cause some major issues. This was the day I learned that I wasn't allergic to them, which was probably the only mercy in all of this. I did, however, get horribly sick, throwing up, struggling to sleep through the pain, dealing with other issues. The swelling and blistering on my face were so bad that I could barely open my eyes. I remember one of the kids coming to visit me in the hospital, and he joked that my face looked like a hamburger. That comment alone added a whole new level of terror to this. As mentioned, I wasn't allergic, thankfully. If I were, I can tell you that this story would have had a much more grim ending, one that someone else would have had to have written. I was left with a number of scars from the blistering and scabbing on my face, and I still actually have these scars all this time later. The right side of my face is definitely not my good side, is all I have to say to that. To this day, I cannot stand the sight of ants. Each tiny little bugger reminded me of that hike and what they're capable of. I guess all I can say is, if you decide to go hiking out alone on a summer day, try to watch your step. And if you see a mound of dirt that is teeming with activity, just stay away from it, because the consequences might just leave you scarred. I used to sell a lot of stuff on Craigslist. It was really the only place to go to sell stuff at the time, other than a yard sale. I suppose after some time, I got too comfortable with it and let my guard down some as well. I am a female, weighing about 180 and about 5'5" at the time, so not small but not out of shape, and I'd like to think I could handle myself if I was in danger. I guess that adds to me letting my guard down though. When I do sell stuff, I always do it in a public place, typically in a store like a coffee shop, bank parking lot, because there are typically lots of security, or anywhere really with a large group of people. My ex had been living with me for a good part of a year before we split up. I told him he had a week to get all of his crap out while I was on vacation. I had a guy friend that was going to be going over there to feed my cat while I was gone, so I was confident he wouldn't do anything stupid or take any of my stuff. It wasn't an easy breakup. He cheated on me. We tried to make it work afterwards, but it wasn't the same, so he wasn't disrespectful or anything, thankfully, but I guess you just never really know a person. Obviously, right? After I got back, I noticed there were still some random things he left there, like his toothbrush, some of his clothes that he left in the dryer, and his crappy old Xbox that didn't work anymore. He kept saying he was going to fix it, even though he didn't know squat about electronics. Conveniently though, he took all the games and controllers for it and literally just left the unit and the giant power cable. So I texted him asking if he wanted the stuff he left, giving him one last chance. He didn't respond, so I tried 2 more times, and I got an unpleasant response from his new girl, as she claimed, and decided then it was my stuff to do as I want with it.
so I thought I would try to get a little money out of it. He had a couple sports jerseys he left, and a nice pair of shoes that went pretty fast, and then the Xbox. I did specify it was only the console itself and that it didn't work, so people didn't think I was getting away with some scam. I thought maybe someone out there could actually fix it or use the parts. I didn't know a thing about the stuff either, so I just listed it for $50. It didn't take long for me to get responses for it. Some people, of course, trying to get me to give it to them for free since it didn't work. Others more concerned about finding out if I was female and asking personal things about me. I did have one guy that didn't come off weird and seemed pretty straightforward with his questions. He asked if I knew what was wrong with it, why I wanted to sell it instead of fixing it, things like that. He even asked me to try doing something with it and tell him what lights came on, so I obliged. After all this, he then asked where to meet, what day and time. We were going to meet up at a park near this church that was about 20 minutes from my home, but pretty close to my work. The next day, I texted the guy to confirm he was still interested, and he confirmed. I then headed to the park, found a bench, and sat on it with the console in a bag next to me, waiting for the guy to show up. While I'm watching a couple of kids playing on the swings, I see a guy pull up, get out with no kids or dogs with him, and come look around the park like he was looking for something. I asked if he was Scott, and he smiled and confirmed he was. I confirmed who I was and motioned to the bag. He was in like a mechanic's jumpsuit and was trying to wipe his hands off to shake mine. I wasn't bothered by it and mentioned it as well. I pulled out the console and explained it was just that and the power cable, and he reached for his wallet and pulled out cash. He started sorting out the bill and waved a 20 at me, asking if I had change. I will say one thing about cash sales like this. If you agree on a price with someone, make sure you bring the right amount and have the ability to break it yourself. Because so many times I had people do this to me, hoping I would just take the lesser amount and they get a discount. And it's rude, at least in my opinion. I will take my item back home and try with someone else instead of getting ripped off. Anyways, I told him I didn't and he gave me 60 instead, saying it was his fault after all. After asking several times if he was sure, he confirmed and I said thank you and started putting it back in my pocket. That's when things started getting weird. He asked me if I was here alone, and I confirmed this, but as I was trying to make a comment about being in a public place, he chuckled a bit and shook his head. I got a little annoyed by this and just stared at him. He said I should be more careful meeting up with strangers because you never know what their intentions are, and said since I was so pretty, I could easily be targeted. I made some kind of comment about how he just completely flipped this experience and that I can take care of myself. I started to get up to leave when he grabbed me by my wrists and said, "See, I could have already had you subdued and in my car." He had such an evil smile on his face, and right before I was going to shake my arm free, he let go of me. I called him a name, loudly enough that a few parents turned around and looked at us as I left. I watched in my mirror as he slowly got up from the bench and waved at me, smiling. Why the hell would you say something like that? It's not helpful, and I don't see how anyone would have found it to be. Thankfully, I never saw him again, but it didn't stop him from texting me a few times, asking if I wanted to meet up for some coffee or lunch. I politely told him to shove off and blocked his number. So I guess that's just to say, be careful out there with who you do business with. Not everyone has the best intentions in mind. Hi, my name is Cynthia. My friends call me Cindy. I will not use my last name or the city I live in for privacy reasons. I have long, white, blonde hair with big ocean blue eyes with a voluptuously curvy figure that still makes men's heads turn and smile at me when I walk by on the street. By the way, I am 60 years old in 2023, and I am also a grandmother and nurse. But please let me share with you a horrifying experience from my past that I was lucky to get out of. It was summertime, 1975, and I was 12 years old, playing on my swing set in my backyard when I heard the all too familiar ice cream truck chimes going up my long street. I immediately had a smile on my face as I got off my swing and rushed inside my house to get the money I needed from my small safe. My favorite ice cream was chocolate, and I wanted to pay for a chocolate ice cream cone. When I got outside, the ice cream truck had already passed by my house, but he heard my screams to please wait as he then stopped his truck. When the truck stopped, I soon saw the ice cream man was an elderly, thin man wearing a white, good humor ice cream hat and a white uniform. This was a different man altogether from the usual man who came to my street. I felt a little chill that something was not right, but it quickly passed when the thin-faced elderly ice cream man looked at me smiling and asked what ice cream I wanted. "Chocolate ice cream, please," I said, smiling broadly to him. I could not wait to get this ice cream in my mouth because it was a very hot summer day, and the taste of it would be so yummy, I thought to myself. I was wearing my blue summer dress and black Mary Jane shoes on my feet. The ice cream man then looked me up and down. His stare made me very nervous. "Wow, you're a pretty little girl, and very well developed for your age too. What is your name, honey?" he asked, still leering at me as he then took his bright, bony hand and ran his skinny, long fingers through my long, lush blonde head of hair, which I did not like because he did not ask permission to do so, and this was a stranger. I also noticed while he was running his hands through my hair, he was beginning to breathe harder and harder, like he was getting excited doing this, turned on, if you will. But before I could object, the elderly ice cream man said to me, "Come on inside the truck and look at the yummy treats up close, so you could better decide. And by the way, my name's Mr. Keebler." I realize at my age now that this was wrong, but as a little girl, I was not thinking about stranger danger as much as kids today. Even though in the early 1970s, serial killer Dean Corll was killing young boys and men, and other child killers were on the loose too. But the 1970s was a time where you could be away from home almost all day, and your mom would not be calling everybody on the phone where you were, and hitchhiking was much more common in those days too. So, against my better judgment, I took this strange ice cream man's hand and entered his ice cream truck. "I'm Cindy, by the way," I said, finally giving him my name. The elderly ice cream man just smiled as his heavy, excited breathing got heavier. The ice cream treats looked amazing. There was vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry ice cream with different color popsicles, chocolate eclairs, vanilla ice cream bars covered with chocolate coating. I still wanted my chocolate cone though, and just when I turned to say something to the elderly ice cream man, he was behind the wheel of his truck and took off down the road with me inside it. Instead of screaming, I just said to him, "Sir, where are you taking me?" The ice cream man said nothing, but I could hear and see his maniac laughing face through the driver's shield. The ice cream truck quickly pulled into a long, dark alley and stopped. The elderly Mr. Keebler then faced me saying, "Now, I let you in my ice cream truck to view the ice cream up close. I need you to do me a favor now, dear," he said sternly. I was not stupid. I knew I was in a heap of trouble with a pedophile and possibly a killer too. I was just about to scream as he covered my mouth with his big hand. But just when he did, I heard a loud police car siren behind the truck. A young policeman quickly got out and ordered at gunpoint for Mr. Keebler to step out of the vehicle as he handcuffed him and read him his rights. Turns out that the neighborhood watch lady, Mrs. Simmons, saw my plight and called the police on Mr. Keebler, saving my life, which I of course was grateful and thanked her for this. But I do wonder and worry how many children were not as fortunate as I am. I was allowed to grow up and have a full life. I was a lucky girl indeed. In my 45 years on this earth, I've kind of been everywhere throughout the continental US. Most people would refer to me as a drifter. I like to look at myself as more of an adventurer. I never locked myself down to one place, and I've always lived my life to the fullest extent that I could while enjoying the sights and scenery that most people ignore. I know that most people don't have the ability to do what I do with my time, but I have enough money to live, and I seriously enjoy not being chained to any one location. I've hiked and backpacked and camped pretty much in every state, but I'm partial to the West Coast more than anything. It has some of the most beautiful, untouched wilderness that's out there. I've spent some of my favorite nights camping in woods up near Montana all by myself. That said, if you spend enough time in the woods by yourself, you are absolutely bound to find something weird. There was one trip in particular that sticks out in my mind that is worth talking about. On one of my camping trips, I found a perfect area of woods that was comfortable and empty. Well, I thought it was empty until I got about a quarter or a half mile into the woods and found what appeared to be an abandoned community. That may not be the right word, but by it I mean that there were small houses just outside the tree line in a completely secluded and surrounded area. This was a place that houses seriously had no business being, yet here they were. I admit that I checked out the small community, and again, I'm only using that word because I cannot think of a better way to describe it. It was a town or a village. It was just 4 houses that looked old as hell and run down, sitting inside of a forest clearing. Behind one of those houses was a small playground that looked legitimately run down, like there hadn't been a child to play on the equipment in a couple decades. The climbing equipment and monkey bars were nothing more now than a tetanus nightmare. The merry-go-round thing, or whatever you call it, did not go round whatsoever. The center part of it was completely rusted and seized in place. There were a handful of toys that were strewn around the playground area, but they were all broken or sun-bleached. At this point, I had decided in my mind that this place was likely sufficiently abandoned, and I went to check out one of the houses next. I went to the house next door and peered in through the back door window. Despite the window being dirty and there being a curtain, I could see that there was in fact still furniture in the house. I could see part of the living room, and from where I was, there was a chair, an old couch, and a CRT television that was sitting in the corner of the room. Then I did the illegal thing that I probably shouldn't have, and I broke into the house. I say broke in, but I just more so walked in. The back door was unlocked. The first room in the door was what appeared to be a mudroom with a washer and dryer in it. There was a box of detergent sitting on the washer and some dryer sheets on the drying, but nothing too crazy in this room. Then I walked into the kitchen area where the door led, and honestly, that's where it got strange. The cabinets were all closed, but as I opened them, they were full. There was a pantry that was filled with old-looking canned foods. There were dishes in the strainer next to the sink, but none in the sink. There was a dining room table that had places set with a vase that had plastic flowers in the middle. Nothing about it screamed abandoned, other than the significant layer of dust on everything. I pushed on into the house, and it all just got weirder by the room. There were pictures on the walls, photos of what looked like paintings on canvas that looked like they were hand done. The bedrooms all had beds that were made, and there were clothes in the dressers. On top of that, there was a laundry basket in the hallway that had clothing in it. Now, I know to some people that this may not sound weird or creepy, but all of the houses in the area were similar to this one in that they were furnished and full of random belongings, but they were also a bit messy and completely coated in dust and dirt. It was completely clear that they were all abandoned. These houses were not in use and hadn't been for quite a long time. The dishes by the sink in the first house tell me that whoever lived here probably left in a hurry or with expectations of coming back. These houses were completely abandoned, and they were abandoned in a hurry. The people that left all of their belongings, food, furniture, etc. I have no idea why they would have done that, and I cannot think of any scenario where someone would have to leave their homes permanently in that state. If anyone has any thoughts, I'm open to hearing them.